morning. I think we can start. We can see you on the screen and online. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to a day-long workshop or half-a-day-long workshop on the current and forgotten migration plights, Ukraine, Belarus, and Afghanistan. This is a workshop that has been organized in the framework of the Jean Monnet module MARS, Migration, Asylum, and Rights of Minor, coordinated at the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna by Assistant Professor Associate Professor Francesca Biondi Dal Monte, and which has been created, this workshop, with the effort of Professor Dal Monte's PhD students, and in particular Chiara Scissa. I would like to thank you all for making sure that this conversation is possible this morning at the Scuola Sant'Anna. The main idea behind this meeting is the fact that the overall foreign policy agendas of the West in general, the European Union in particular, and Italy included, appear to be entirely focused over the last couple of months on the conflict in Ukraine for understandable reasons. But at the same time, this emphasis has led to an obfuscation, to an overlooking of other very important crises or so-called crises that affect the European borders in a broader sense, and in particular within this framework that have an impact on migration management and the responses to migration challenges that are put forward by the European Union. There's a number of them. We are quite used in this institution in particular to discussing and focusing on the migration-related challenges that have to do with the Southern European border, dealing with Libya, with Morocco and Western Sahara, with Syria, etc. But today we want to focus in particular on the Eastern European border that has received perhaps less attention within this institution and in Italy more in general. So we are particularly delighted to focus our conversation today on three important cases that affect the European Eastern border, which include, of course, the conflict in Ukraine, but also the complex situations that we're dealing with at the Poland-Belarus border, as well as the conflict in Afghanistan and its impact on European border, particularly in terms of migration. In order to address these topics, we have created three main panels. Within each panel, we have three speakers. One speaker will be in charge of providing a framework to let us understand what are the main implications in terms of conflict dynamics that are affecting that specific context in particular. The second speaker for each panel will particularly focus on how these conflicts or these dynamics affect, these security dynamics affect migrants and the vulnerability of migrants trapped at EU border. And the third speaker per each panel will particularly address how the EU has responded or failed to respond or framed its response to the migration challenges created by these border issues. So I am in charge of chairing the first of these panels, and I'm particularly grateful to the organizers for providing me with this task. Unfortunately, I need to apologize since the outset. I will need to be quite strict on the management of the time because in a very unpolite fashion, I will be obliged to leave this meeting right after the first panel. It's a very busy day for all of us, so I will try to be a bit tight, a bit strict on the timing afforded to each speaker. So the three speakers that are joining us today for the first panel include Professor Francesco Strazzari, who is Professor of International Relations at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies, as well as Adjunct Professor at the Johns Hopkins University in Bologna. He's an expert in peace and conflict studies with a particular focus on political violence and extra-legal governance in Europe and in its neighborhood in particular. Then we're having Professor Paweł Kaczmarczyk, if I pronounce it correctly, I'm sorry if I don't, professor at the Faculty of Economic Sciences at the University of Warsaw, and since 2016, the director of the Center of Migration Research. He is a member or affiliate of numerous bodies dealing with mobility and migration-related issues, including the Committee on Migration Research of the Polish Academy of Science, and he is cooperating with a number of international organizations in the same field. And then we have Professor Dal Monte, Associate Professor in Constitutional Law at the Sant'Anna School of Advanced Studies, as well as the coordinator of the DREAM project, Data Research and Analysis on Migration, the DREAM research area, as well as the Jean Monnet module, MARS, Migration, Asylum and Rights of Minors that we mentioned before. She has also managed other migration and asylum-related projects and has collaborated with several public administrations in Italy in particular on issues that have to do with social welfare and migration. So without further ado, I think I will leave the floor for an approximately 50 minutes presentation to Professor Strazzari, who will provide us with a framework of the conflict and crisis which is currently affecting Ukraine and its potential impact on the European borders. Professor Strazzari, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Many thanks, Luca, and thank you all the colleagues, Francesca, Chiara, and everyone behind the organization of this meeting. I will just try to share with you a few general thoughts that hopefully can help a bit and shed some analytical light on the events that we are witnessing with the purpose of paving the way for looking into the migration and internal displacement question, which is prominent every time we're talking about armed conflict, let alone about intense or high-level intensity conflict, a conventional war like the one we are witnessing painfully every day. So talking about Ukraine means opening a discussion about the post-Soviet state with all the legacies that implies in terms of population dynamics and management. I won't go in detail about how deep the question can be when it comes to who lives, resides, and moves where within a broad federation in real existing socialism. I would like to say that my interest in the Ukrainian case stems from a study I did when I was a graduate student many years ago on the repatriation of the Crimean Tatars back to the peninsula of Crimea after deportations that took place in the imminence of the Yalta Conference in 1945, when Stalin decided that all the non-Slavic speaking population in southern Soviet Union were to be deported under the collective guilt of collaboration with the Nazis. And they were put on trains and deported into the heart of Central Asia, subjected to highly restrictive and repressive residence conditions, which meant their decimation and memories of pain and discrimination, which are still alive as far as today's dynamics are concerned. Not only are they alive because of the way in which the Crimean Tatars have been sowing a dialogue with a number of political parties and individuals in Ukraine in the past 20 years, but also because we're talking about the peninsula of Crimea, which was, as you know, seized at some lightning speed by Vladimir Putin in 2014, which created already some internal displacement inside Ukraine, but also that episode sets a bit a precedent for the aspiration that the Kremlin had in seizing part of or the whole of Ukraine 2 months ago by launching the special operation, to use their own words, that we are still witnessing. So this idea of a special operation is very much molded by the experience of the seizure of Crimea with the famous unmarked green men that were deployed for incorporating the Crimea into the Russian world, as with the idea of Ruski Mir, it was then crafted. I mean, I think starting from Crimea is an important, could be interesting, because the Crimea exists as an autonomous republic within a constitution, the one of Ukraine, which since independence, 1991, defines the Ukraine as a unitary state. So we already start with a kind of constitutional paradox of a unitary state with a high level of autonomy, which will be negotiated facing resurgent Russian separatism starting from 1991 up to a peak in 1994, where a deal was made between the leadership of Russian separatism in Crimea and Kiev, in the context in which Ukraine, which is not today's Ukraine, it has to be premised politically speaking or politologically speaking, Ukraine in 1991 features a number of patterns in terms of voting and identity expressed in a number of ways which are different from today's Ukraine. But at that time, we're talking about a country which, in terms of, for example, voting pattern, was split very clearly between a portion, mainly the western portion of the country, voting for one presidential candidate, Kravchuk, and another one in the eastern part of the country, Kuchma, supporting a different idea of where the Ukraine should stand and how Ukrainian independence should be qualified. Nonetheless, I think it is worth strengthening, worth underlining that the transition towards democracy in Ukraine was characterized by a number of elements of ambivalence, which could be also be seen, historically speaking, as a fertile soil for negotiating the identity of a newly independent country. A newly independent country which has a memory of the horrors of collectivization during Soviet times, especially in the 30s, which meant, again, the decimation of peasant population in a punitive stigma which they suffered under Stalinism, and which left a mark in terms of the decisions that were made as World War II, deflagrated, with the creation, as you know, of the pogrom in the city of Lviv. This, incidentally, is the city from which Simon Wiesenthal, who created then the famous Nazi hunting institution, was a survivor of, and painful memories of genocidal policies during World War II. I was saying that that fertile soil could have been perhaps in the limbo in which Ukraine was left between a weakened Russian Federation in the years of Boris Yeltsin on the one hand, and NATO countries left without an enemy at the time and wondering about their future. Ukraine was denuclearized, very much a program very much assisted by Germany at the time. And the hope was for a transition which could help reframe Ukrainian identity that could accommodate the different traumas that historically existed in the country and in the region in a broader sense. Perhaps creating a sense of identity less hostage to virulent form of nationalism, be that neo-imperial Pan-Slavism maneuvered from Moscow, or the kind of nationalist repressed identity that was pulsating in some of the east, of the west, sorry, of the country, in Galicia mainly. There were jokes at the time about multilingualism constituting a base for that, the idea that any president in Ukraine would speak publicly Ukrainian, but quarreling with the wife or the husband in Russian at home. I mean, this can be seen as a way of maybe dismissing the idea of an originality of Ukrainian nationality, but also could be seen as a potential for renegotiating identities in a broader space, which starts from Moldova or Moldavia, included Belarus, where multilingualism or the use of Russian as a vernacular language could pave the way for unprecedented solution in terms of what daily life or the daily material constitution people live in could be constituted of. This, as we know, was not the case, mainly, I mean, in a parallel path where the reassertive identity of Russia under Vladimir Putin, starting with 1998, 1999, carved its own course with a distinctive view denying the existence of independent countries and resurrecting including rhetoric of Russians abroad being a vehicle or for national identity in the near abroad, as it was called at that point. Or, and the other side, and I think this is something we should really strengthen, the vagaries of the Ukrainian transition in terms of democratic life. We all know how problematic that was. This is nothing analysts want to dwell upon today due to the fact that Ukraine is under aggression, and it doesn't make much sense to go and dissect about what went wrong in terms of democratic transition. But it is clear that it became very clear with the new century that the problems in terms of politics of oligarchs and corruption, which were inherited from the transition and privatization in the 90s, were very much projected into the new decades in the new millennium, up to a point in which basically starting from urban strata, insufferance vis-a-vis corrupted politics, the idea that whatever kind of political parties you have, you always have in parliament, in the Verkhovna Rada, a kind of ample, broad group of notables in the middle that can be bought and in a rather fluid manner position themselves based on existing interests. Well, all of that was very much at the origin of resentment, which started with the so-called the colored revolutions in the early 2000s, which were very important for lightening up some hope that Ukraine could find, that the transition could find its own dimension bottom up, somehow in terms of social movements in a non-violent way, trying to renegotiate how the political system would handle a number of questions with the political economy and the political sociology, i.e. the identity of the country in an area which at that point was still in a limbo. NATO had been expanding already. It was not possible to say expanding in the West. We had to say enlarging because it was more palatable. But there were questions about how that was done in terms of promises that were made and how that would go down in accommodating also Russian requests at the point in which Russia, at the same time, was on its path to what many people, especially when Putin stepped down due to constitutional requirements, many people in Moscow and St. Petersburg saw as a period of fat cows, economically speaking, and a period that could be generative of a new political class in urban Russia that would sit relatively comfortable with a pluralist political landscape also in the neighborhood. As we know, that completely collapsed. That world of the uptown Moscow is no longer there. I don't have to dwell and analyze that. What I would like to say is that the political developments in Ukraine remain pretty controversial, and we know how the hopes that were raised by the election of Yushchenko were dashed, how that ended up in a rather intricate political plot, including Yulia Tymoshenko, and she ending up under arrest, and how all of that finally got to, and I'm really skipping through years of political stories, but I think it's important to get a sense of where we stand today, how all of that went into the polarization that we saw when Ukraine signed or refused to sign, due to the veto coming from Moscow, the association agreement with the European Union. And we are at the Maidan times, and which catapults us into today's ultra-polarized dynamics. Yanukovych was the political protector of the interest of the Donbas region. Once he was defenestrated, the Donbas went its own way and proclaimed an independence, which lies at the very heart of the political situation of today. 2 minutes to say that the war that was rekindled by the invasion of Moscow troops is one that today sits at the on a fulcrum. If we look at the political dynamics today, we see Russia very much intent on consolidating territorial acquisition and political management of southern and east Ukraine. But also we see that, militarily speaking, this push after aborting the northern front on Kiev and finding itself in a check on conquering Kharkiv, well, the situation in the south is one whereby if Russia doesn't capitalize on its accumulation of strength and breaks through the front in the next week, at the pace in which Russian armored vehicles are being destroyed, we might see Russia in a week from now at the starting point, meaning with no capacity to break through, and therefore increasingly, let's say, embittered in a frustrated campaign, which is perhaps behind the fact that while the US has been pushing itself into saying that the war should be won by weakening Russia, which includes a strong ideological element in that, also something close to a regime change. Well, at the same time, we see Sergei Lavrov yesterday, as we saw, saying that a nuclear scenario is something realistic at this point. And Russia has been miscalculating a lot, but also it has been keeping faith to what they promised in negative terms. And therefore, all of that raises an alarm that Ukraine might not, the situation in Ukraine and the political quagmire of Ukraine might actually the fulcrum for a wider regional or broad regional crisis, which includes something about the fate of incomplete democratization and the stalemate in which political systems found themselves. We might also quote problems in the democratization of Moldova, due also to the presence of Transnistria and military, the 14th Motorized Division from Russia. And we might also include Georgia and the situation in the two territories that were incorporated by Russia. All of these three cases include an element in which the international situation and how Russia has been maneuvering and manipulating its territorial and political claims have to do with dynamics of political transition domestically. One last word to say that in today's war, the discussion is very much one about which square kilometer or which form of political integrity is to be guaranteed or conquered. There's very little discussion about political formula, about autonomy, federation, confederation, anything that modern political theory has been producing to come to terms with how a political system and territorial makeup are to find a fit with one another. And the question of migration and population fits in the middle of that. Of political solution and territorial makeup is where the population fits, and is where massive refugees and displacement waves are being created. I would stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Strazzari, for this very insightful introduction into the current and even longer-term dynamics of the conflict in Ukraine. I now leave the floor to Professor Kaczmarczyk for a discussion more into the challenges of migration. Professor Kaczmarczyk, thanks for joining us through WebEx. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me. Can you also see my
yes, we can.
Slides? Perfect. So as you see, I like to. So first of all, many thanks for having me. My aim today is very simple. I'm expected to say a few words about recent flows from Ukraine to Poland and related challenges. However, I decided to structurize my short intervention in the following way. So we'll just start with some contextual issues, and I guess they will somehow complement what has been said already. Then I will just say a few words about the process itself, and we'll finish with outlook and possibly also scenarios for the future. And hopefully I'll manage to do this within 15 minutes or so. So let me start with the context, and you know the context is super important, and maybe it can sound and looks strange for you, but I'll just try to explain why it's so important in this particular case. Poland, just 10 years back, was definitely not an immigration country. The number of immigrants in the country has been estimated at around 100,000. And in terms of share of immigrants in the total population, Poland was in fact ranked as probably the last member of the European Union. So then something started to change. And if you just take a look at the slide, this is the data showing the first residence permits issued in European Union countries. Apparently around 2014-15, something started changing, and Poland quite unexpectedly became the European leader in terms of new first residence permits issued way before such countries as United Kingdom or Germany, for example. And the reason for it was twofold. So on the one hand, what we already heard about a little, there was of course the supply side. And there was the war in eastern part of Ukraine, and of course, quite substantial migration pressure from the side of Ukrainians. However, there was also the second side, the demand side. And the demand side is related to massive labor market needs on the side of the Polish labor market. And secondly, the role of simplified procedure. I will just go back to this just in a second. So it's quite important to know that first of all, the war from 2014 played quite important role in transforming Poland into a new immigrant destination, but also it has an impact on what is happening today, apparently. So if you just take a look at this slide, it just shows the stock of migrants in Poland as end of 2016. And apparently it shows already the transformation of Poland into net immigration country with around 750,000 of immigrants staying in Poland, majority of them being Ukrainians, as you see, majority of them being temporary migrants, and also quite substantial share of those with a tertiary education. And interestingly enough, also majority of them staying in the Mazowiecki region, with Warsaw as the most important destination. However, the story continued over the next years. And in fact, what we know from the available estimates, before the pandemic, the stock of immigrants in Poland has been estimated to 2.2 million of immigrants. And this is really massive change as compared to just decade before. What we know also that contrary to many other European countries, the pandemic did not impact the stock of immigrants in Poland that much. We observed some decline, but that was rather small. And in fact, there was a huge recovery already in 2021. This is important because already just in February 2022, the stock of immigrants in Poland was around 2 million, and majority of them being Ukrainians, apparently. I just mentioned before the role of the demand factor and particularly the simplified procedure. And this is quite necessary comment to be made right now. You know that in the case of European Union, as a foreigner, you generally need to have work permit to get a job. However, in Poland, since 2006, we have something that is being called simplified procedure, and according to the procedure, it is possible to start employment without work permit. Before it was up to 6 months, within 12 months, right now is up to 2 years. And why it's so important? Because this is, first of all, very simple, very quick, and also very cheap procedure. What are the consequences? They are clear. So if you just take a look at the slide, these are just the data for 2018, 2021. And it shows, the data shows the three main channels in the case of the Polish labor market. Apparently, the declaration based on the simplified procedure is the most important. And here is the key point. In every single case, Ukrainian citizens played the most important role. In the case of declarations, it was almost 90%. In the case of work permits, over 70%. In the case of seasonal work permits, almost 100%. So it simply says that migration from Ukraine to Poland before the war has been already massive, and predominantly it was labor migration, also temporary labor migration, or even circular in many cases. This map is also quite important to understand what is happening right now. I said that just a decade ago, immigration to Poland was largely concentrated in just a few big cities, with Warsaw as the major destination area. However, the situation changed substantially since then. And in fact, before the war, Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian workers have been present all over the country, including also small cities, small powiats. So of course, still, if you just take a look, there is a concentration in big agglomerations. So it's not unique, but apparently the presence of Ukrainians was quite common in many Polish localities. Then the second contextual piece is the situation of Belarusian-Polish border. However, I know that Kamila will discuss the case later, so let me just skip this piece right now. What is interesting for the next part of my presentation is that apparently just half a year ago, we discussed this issue as a serious migration crisis. Apparently, it looks quite different now after just a few months. But this will be discussed soon by Kamila, I guess. So what is happening now? This is the data coming from UNHCR, and this is data you probably know very well. The aggregated number of refugees who are leaving the war zone in Ukraine is estimated to be over 5 million of people, and majority of those arrived in Poland, almost 3 million. I will just say a few words about it in a second. Apparently, Moldova is the country that received the biggest number of Ukrainians in relative terms. I mean, in relative to the population. How it looks like in the case of Poland, and this is the processual part of the presentation. The figure you see right now, it just shows the daily number of arrivals. These are the blue bars. And then we have daily number of exits and also net balance. And what is clearly visible here, that apparently the first 2-3 weeks of the process they've been the most important, and this is where the stock I will just speak about in a second comes from. Since there, the dynamics is apparently much slower. In last few days, we even observed a negative net balance, and this is mainly because of departures of people trying to get to Ukraine because of Easter, but also because it's just quite natural need to see what is happening with their homes and the families there. However, what is also interesting, if you just take a look at this slide, it just shows the volatility of the of arrivals and exits in Poland. And apparently, it shows that there's a huge volatility in terms of those flows. It simply says that we have to do with a really mobile population, and this is what we definitely should consider, and also we should discuss it maybe later, because the situation we are facing is really unique. So first of all, before the war, border between Poland and Ukraine was relatively open, and that was because of liberal labor migration policy. Since at the beginning of the war, it's almost fully open. So people can come to Poland and also other countries easily, then can move further to other European countries, but also then can go back whenever they want. And this is what is really shown here when you just take a look at the upper figure on the slide. So what is the outcome? The outcome is shown here. Almost 3 million people already arrived in Poland since the beginning of the war. Over 700,000 left Poland. So these are just arrivals and exits. So in many cases, we can just speak about the same people. Unfortunately, our knowledge about the process is relatively limited, but we have already some data. The first source is just registered data. It's based on the registration related to obtaining of the ID, Polish ID. Still today, I guess today it's over 1 million people who registered to obtain the ID. And we know the structure of the population is quite unique. Almost half of the population, they are children, so person age below 18 years old. If we just look at the people at productive age, of the total, over 40% they are women, and the share of elderly is relatively low. It's 4% more or less. So this structure is very special if we just compare it to the previous waves of Ukrainian migration to Poland, because in the previous cohort, the share of migrants at productive age was around 98%. So the share of children and elderly was extremely low. Right now, it has changed. Already around 100,000 of people, mainly females, of course, they managed to be incorporated into the labor market, but this is, of course, slow process. I will just talk about it in the second. Probably the most interesting case is Warsaw. Unfortunately, I still don't have the most recent data, but as for the end of March, the number of persons who arrived to Warsaw is estimated to be around 600,000. Out of this number, around 300,000 stayed in Warsaw. Importantly, there was a huge number of persons still in care facilities, various care facilities, and around 13,000 of kids in education system already. I said already, however, the number is still relatively small. When I'm just talking about Warsaw, maybe I should just say a few words about the phenomenon we are facing and we are discussing quite often. And this is, again, quite unique in the case of situations like that, because as you probably know, majority of Ukrainians who are arriving in Poland, they found shelter in just people's flats and homes. And I would just like to say maybe 2 or 3 things. The first one, it was only possible because of the fact that already before the war, there was a huge number of Ukrainians residing in Poland. This is why I just included the contextual part before. And secondly, those people who are just providing shelter and protection, these are not necessarily Polish people, so Polish citizens. We don't know what is the share of Ukrainians, in fact, who are supporting other Ukrainians, but from anecdotal evidence, it apparently follows that almost everyone, every single Ukrainian who was before the war in Poland is somehow involved in providing help to other Ukrainians. So I would like to finalize my talk, if I still have 2 or 3 minutes, with a brief outlook.
You actually have 1 minute, but I will give you 2.
Okay, so I will do my best to use this too. So apparently the point is that as for now, there are many more unknowns than knowns. So first of all, we do not know when and how the war will end. Secondly, we do not know what will be the economic, political, and social situation in Ukraine after the war, hopefully. And this is again, this has been quite nicely described before, how complex the situation was already before. So we don't know, in fact, what will be the future inflows and outflows from Poland. However, we decided to work on. Okay, we just did a statistical exercise. We just tried to build a few scenarios, looking at what is happening now and what can happen in the future. And what is really important, and this is again the unique feature of the story, we are looking at the population that in fact comprises 2 subpopulations. So first of all, this 1.35 million, this is the number of people who've been residing in Poland already. However, they've been people moving between Poland and Ukraine. So apparently the war has impact on their situation as well. And the additional 1.55 million of people who arrived after the war. So altogether, we are speaking about 2.9 million of Ukrainian residents staying in Poland, with 40% of them being females and also quite a share of children. And what we are doing right now, we are considering 3 main scenarios. The first one being just a long and continuous conflict. The second, assuming relatively short-term peace, and also relatively fast and also easy recovery, and that would include massive returns and also selective stays in Poland. The third scenario assumes a long war and very difficult recovery, and that would mean, of course, additional inflows, particularly female children and elderly. And if you just take a look at those scenarios, apparently they would differ in terms of stocks, with the third one being the most negative. However, what is really important, they also differ in structural features. So this is what you see right now on the slide, more or less. What is super important, it's first of all, that it really doesn't matter what kind of scenario we are focusing on. In every single case, we assume that the stock of migrants after the war will be much larger than it was before the war. And secondly, the structure of the stock will be substantially different, with a large share of children, still particularly in scenario number 3, and also growing shares of elderly. Apart from that, okay, if you just take a look at the slide, there's also a fourth scenario. We perceive it as a very unwelcomed, so that's why I would skip it. But the defeat of Ukraine definitely would mean a massive flight, not only to Poland, but also to other countries. I can also speak about challenges, but I guess my time is out, so we can leave it maybe for discussion. These are the main challenges we are discussing right now in Poland. And I'm happy, of course, to focus more on that on this piece later during discussion.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Kaczmarczyk, and for your attempt to stick to the time. We're very conscious of the fact that there will be a lot to talk about, and certainly there may be additional questions regarding the outlook and the challenges that the current migratory flows, mixed migratory flows may involve for Poland in particular. So I now leave the floor to Professor Dal Monte, who will guide us through the challenges of the EU response to the challenge of migration and mixed migration flows and asylum seekers from Ukraine into Europe. Professor Dal Monte, the floor is yours. Are you coming here? Yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Luca. I have a PowerPoint presentation. Thank you very much, Luca, for your introduction. And my intervention is related to the European Union response to this emergency. And first of all, I would like to analyze, to give you some information regarding the procedure activated by the European Union regarding the activation, the implementation of the Directive on Temporary Protection. And then I will also analyze other measures adopted at the European Union level as an answer, a response to this influx of Ukrainian people towards other European member states. With more than 4 million refugees, 6.5 million internally displaced, and an estimated 13 million trapped by hostilities in just over 1 month, the Ukrainian displacement crisis is unprecedented. In response to this exodus from Ukraine to other European member states, this is predicted to be Europe's largest refugee crisis in this century. And the European Union has enacted the legislation to provide immediate temporary protection to refugees. Other measures adopted at European level include humanitarian aid packages, a solidarity platform, and greater flexibility for states to draw on European Union funding. And also a new European Union border management guidelines aim to enable the efficient management of arrivals and speed up support for vulnerable persons. This exodus was unprecedented, but also the response of the European Union was unprecedented. In fact, this is the first time in which the European Union implemented the Directive 55 of 2001 regarding the temporary protection to give immediate protection in the European Union for Ukrainians and third country nationals with refugees or permanent resident status, considering and assessing the existence of a mass influx into the Union of displaced persons who have had to leave Ukraine as a consequence of an armed conflict. This decision give to the European member states the possibility to recognize a specific form of protection of people flying from Ukraine. The mass influx is defined in the Council decision as arrival in the community of a larger number of displaced persons who came from a specific country or geographical area. The protection allows to access to school, healthcare, housing, and work for people who obtain this type of protection. And the first draft of the resolution was quite different from the final version. In fact, the The first version recognized this type of protection to all third country nationals unable to return home, as well as stateless persons. But the final version, as we know, recognized this type of protection only to refugees or permanent residents, third country national with Ukrainians and third country national with refugees or permanent resident status in Ukraine. The legislation at European level also clarifies that member states can go above and beyond the scope, for instance, with complementary national procedure scheme, protection scheme. And UNHCR urge member states to take an inclusive approach by granting temporary status to all those flying. In fact, in the first days of the conflict, more than 100,000 of those fleeing the war zone were non-Ukrainians. And media reports have circulated of racist and xenophobic treatment against non-white people attempting to flee the country. For example, the Human Rights Watch report published on the 4th March documented various instances of Black and Asian people being prevented from boarding trains, being pulled off trains, or being told that all Blacks have to get off the bus. So the important also to include all people flying from Ukraine is really crucial in order to protect fundamental rights of people forced to leave the Ukrainian territory. And another challenge, there are another logistical challenge in preventing the escape of some international students from Ukrainian. So the member states have the possibility to use discretionary powers under the Article 2 of the Council decision, extended the temporary protection, for example, to people who fled Ukraine before the 24th of February 2022, or to third country nationals, irrespective of whether they can return to their countries of origin, or again to stateless persons and nationals of third countries who cannot return in a safe and durable way, irrespective of their residence or migration status in Ukraine. The European Temporary Protection Directive is an old directive, and this type of normative framework was adopted after the Yugoslav war and was designed to be used in an event of a mass influx of or imminent mass influx of people coming into an European Union states. It is a form of temporary protection aimed at offering immediate help by granting large groups of people collective protection status. These people would have protection status for up to a year, with possibility of an extension up to 3 years, without going through individual asylum claims, and allowing access of housing and other benefits, such as education, health, social welfare, resident permits, and so on. The directive also lays down criteria for the reunification of separate families in the case that one or several relatives enjoy temporary protection, but others do not. And to implement the temporary protection directive, at least 15 out of 72 European member states must agree to it. Here you can find the main area in which the temporary protection could provide specific services, access to basic services, for example, related to education, healthcare, housing, access to job, and the focus also on the protection for children. In particular, ECRE strongly endorses the proposed decision on temporary protection, stated that this is the time to implement this directive. But the question is, as you know, why in the past, for example, to the influx of Afghanistan people or Syrian people, this directive was not implemented. The Council that did not did not assess the influx, a massive influx of people to the European Union country, with consequences, with problems related to the type of protection for these people, to the access to basic service, to the also burden also in a certain way to the asylum system of the European member states. Here you can find some data about the migration of Ukrainian people and third country nationals from Ukraine to European member states, elaborated by the European Asylum Agency, the new European Asylum Agency, and you can find this data update at April 2022. And we have more than 5 million people fleeing Ukraine, and only in the week, the second week of April, about the 42% of people. So a very critical situation, and the challenges for the European Union in order to ensure protection to these people. Temporary protection, or also asylum application, because this is also a way for these people to ask for asylum in the European countries. What are the challenges for the European Union? First of all, as already stated by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, one of the main concern is the human trafficking and the also risk for children, for women, for people flying from Ukraine to be victim of traffickers, smugglers. And another important challenge is the management of the borders, and these challenges was addressed thanks to specific guidelines related to the EU border manager in order to promote, to facilitate also the movement, the migration from people to cross frontiers, border of people from Ukraine to the other member states. And another important point is the conclusion of the European Council in the end of March, and the adoption of 10-point plan for stronger European coordination of welcoming people fleeing the war from Ukraine. This 10-point plan concerns, for example, the approach for transportation and information hubs for people flying from Ukraine, reception capacity and accommodation of center in the European member states, and also an anti-trafficking plan, reinforce solidarity with Moldova, a reinforced framework for international cooperation on safe destination, and also address internal security implications of the war in Ukraine. And lastly, adequate resource and funding in a new scheme for the European Union to promote, to support Ukraine and people in the European member states for the reception of people in the European reception states. And also the European Union agency support specifically one member state, Romania, the only state to request a support from the European Union agency. And the in general, usually the European Union Asylum Agency is available to support in this specific situation member states in the implementation of temporary protection. Regarding the specific situation of Romania, Romanian national system has come under disproportionate pressure, with over 500,000 third country nationals having entered Romania since the beginning of the conflict. So a great amount, a great number of people fleeing from Ukraine, and the needs to additional support in order to manage this request. Just to conclude, there are other important measures adopted at European level, and regarding the humanitarian aid, an emergency package of nearly more than 500 million to deal with the humanitarian consequences of the crisis, helping civilians affected by the war, and other million regarding the emergency support program that helps to secure access to basic goods and services such as education, healthcare, and food for these people. And as you know, another important activity of the European Union concerned the adoption of European Union sanctions against Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. These restrictive measures concern different activities, different areas in order to avoid the funding of the war from the Russian perspective, and include, for example, regarding people, travel ban, asset freeze, provision to provide funds, but also regarding entities, the provision also to other type of funding that could be strictly connected also to the funding of war. Other measure regarding the banking system, as you know, and also the commercial activities. So just an overview, but I'm available for any discussion about the implementation of this measure in the member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you so much to Professor Dal Monte for this very interesting presentation into the measures adopted by the European Union to face the challenge of migratory flows, mixed migratory flows from Ukraine into Europe in particular. Now, we are a bit late. I guess the organizers of this conference should have been aware that being late is one of my specialties, so this is part of the program in a sense. I'm afraid that we don't have a lot of time for questions, but I also think that if there are some burning and important questions, it's time to ask them. So for those in the audience who would have some questions, please. I suppose that you need to come here with the microphone. Yeah.
Good morning. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Good morning. Thank you very much to all of you for being here, and thanks, of course, to our chair and to all our speakers. I have a question for Professor Kaczmarczyk, and please, I apologize for my bad pronunciation of your name, so sorry about that. You were mentioning some challenges with regards to the reception of Ukrainians in Poland. I was curious about the housing challenges. Here in Italy, for instance, we have some issues in order to receive migrants coming from Ukraine in Italy. What is the overview there in Poland? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. Any other question from the audience, including from home? I suggest that we collect another one or two questions, if there are, and then we give back the floor to the speakers. So I see another couple of questions in the room. Is there any question for those connected from home? Please let me know by raising your hand on WebEx or just turning on the camera. If not, in the meantime, I invite those in the room to come here. Perhaps I suggest that you briefly introduce yourself, name and role before asking your question. Thank you.
Okay, so good morning. Thank you for the presentations. I'm Kamila. I'm a PhD student in law, and I'm from Hungary. And I have a question to Professor Kaczmarczyk. I also apologize for the pronunciation because we come from the same part of Europe, but our languages are very different. And I have a question regarding the influence of the war in Ukraine to the Visegrad group. So my question is how the war will affect the dynamics between the countries, between the members of the Visegrad group, especially Poland and Hungary. Thank you.
Thank you. So, I think there was one last question in the room, please.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Francesca. I'm a PhD student here at school. And first of all, thank you all for the presentations. They were so interesting. I have a question for Professor Biondi Dal Monte. I was wondering, I had the chance to read a little bit about the EU response to the crisis in Ukraine. And what I was wondering about, since this is an old instrument, but just implemented, just activated now for the first time. So the European Union, it is new for the European Union, and also the implementation will be quite new. And also it's the first time that so many things are introduced. For example, the freedom of choice of the EU country where people can go. That is absolutely new for the European Union. I was wondering, do you think that there could be problems in the long term when the protection granted by the directive will elapse, so in maximum 3 years, as for the applications for refugee status? Because people then will, people will have the freedom of choice as for the state, the European state where they want to go, but then a lot of these people actually could actually decide to stay in the EU and apply for asylum even after the end of the protection provided by the directive. So I was wondering if you think there could be some problems related to the fact that people will have traveled across the EU freely, and then they will find themselves somewhere, and then they will apply for asylum there. And if states will be kind of willing to provide asylum or willing to say, no, this person entered the EU from Poland and they have to apply for asylum there, not, for example, in Italy. Thank you. I hope my question was clear. Maybe it was a bit confused, but
thank you. I think the question was clear. And then I'll abuse my position of chair, and I would like to ask a question. It's more of a curiosity, but this is a question for Professor Biondi Dal Monte. If I understand it right, there has been very limited demands so far for a temporary protection status in Poland. And I would be curious to know why it is the case, according, well, to you or perhaps also to other speakers. And with this question, which I think is the last one, yes, I can then turn back the floor to our speakers, starting with our Polish colleague, that I would ask in first place to clarify the mystery of the pronunciation of his surname, and we really apologize for that.
No, you don't need to apologize. You are perfect. Kaczmarczyk, this is the pronunciation, but you were really close, so that's fine. Let me start with the second question, as the answer here is, I guess, far simpler for me, because I don't know. I don't know. In fact, what's the position of Polish government? In fact, Polish government is quite reluctant to take a clear stance towards the position and activities of Hungarian government. So really, I don't know. So it is just a kind of political issue, and I guess it has more to do with internal politics and not necessarily with the international politics. So that would be my answer here. And going back to the first question, when talking about challenges, intentionally, I'm not focusing that much on labor market and labor market incorporation. And reason here is very simple. I really believe that the Polish labor market is quite well penetrated by Ukrainians. So it's well-trodden economic space. So I guess that it should be relatively easy also for them to enter the labor market. However, what is super challenges is access to public services and public goods. And here, apparently, housing. So this is what the question was about. Housing is probably the key element. As I said, because of spontaneous reaction and enormous empathy and solidarity on part of ordinary people, of course, on part of non-governmental organizations, private companies, local administration, and in the end, also Polish government. We have and we still have kind of safety valve. And the safety valve, it simply comprises private houses, private flats. So because of this, it was simply possible to provide shelter and help for almost 2 million people just overnight. So this is super unusual, I would say. However, as for me, this is a temporary measure only. So what we need desperately right now, we need systemic solutions. And I'm afraid I don't have good news here. This is my personal opinion. The activity of Polish government here is very limited so far. So we need more concrete actions. So what is happening, apparently, there is internal relocation. So people are moving from big agglomerations to smaller cities and also to villages. So they are just trying to find some housing. There is also intra-European relocation, as commented already on a just free basis. But still, according to our estimates, we should consider around 50 or maybe 60% of those who are coming to Poland as people who will stay in the country. And what's the challenge here? You know, the housing market in Poland has been very difficult already before the war. Right now, it became tremendously difficult. So as far as we know, and this is just anecdotal evidence, it's almost impossible right now to rent a flat in big cities in Poland. So we really need, as I said, more concrete actions. Probably we will have also kind of reception centers, maybe not on a large scale, but this is what is probably unavoidable. Maybe one additional comment. You know, the tendency we observe so far is just believe that return to Ukraine will be possible very soon. Because of this, for example, there is a tendency to stay as close to the border as possible, and this is quite visible all the time. However, you know, we don't know really how the situation in Ukraine will develop. So I would assume that a large majority of people who arrived in Poland will stay. So we need solutions, and you know, there are no easy answers here. The same refers to education, to healthcare. I guess this is common for all countries. They are experiencing such massive flows.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And then I will leave the floor to Professor Biondi Dal Monte for the last round of answers.
Thank you for the question. The links between the temporary protection and the international protection is one of the main critical aspects of this procedure and the access to this procedure. In principle, the directive of 2001, Article 3, stated that temporary protection shall not prejudge recognition of refugee status under the Geneva Convention. And also the decision of the Council in March 2022 in Article 17 provides that person enjoying temporary protection must be able to lodge an application for asylum at any time. And the examination of any asylum application not processed before the end of the period of temporary protection shall be completed after the end of that period. And regarding the competencies, the criteria, Article 18 states that the criterion mechanism for deciding which member states is responsible for considering an asylum application shall apply. And in particular, the member state responsible for examining an asylum application submitted by a person enjoying temporary protection shall be the member states which has accepted its transfer onto its territory. So this is, I think, the rule to apply in this situation, but maybe these rules could prevent member states to also accept possible transfer intra-European Union. Maybe we will see about the implementation also regarding this law, this rule. The fact that people, Ukrainian people and international coming from Ukraine do not ask for temporary protection. The reason could be many, but maybe the main, maybe the hope to come back to their territory very soon at the end of the war. Maybe this is the first reason I think that in this period could prevent to ask for temporary protection or international protection in this moment. But we will see, because also at the European level and also some NGOs stress the fact that we need not only urgent measure, but also durable solution for these people. If they stay in other European member states or come back to the territory that we know is completely destroyed, and there will be difficulties in accessing basic rights and so on. So yeah, it's a great challenge for European Union and all the member states regarding this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Biondi Dal Monte, for the answers. And with this, I think we can conclude the first panel, which I think was quite successful. So I would like to thank our speakers, and I invite you to join me in a round of applause for them. And I leave the floor to Professor Biondi Dal Monte, who will actually change her hat and chair the next panel. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you very much for your moderation. Thank you. So, thank you. And now we will start the second panel of this morning regarding the situation in Belarus. The second focus of this seminar is devoted to the emergency situation at the European Union external border with Belarus. In particular, we know that the introduction of the state of emergency in Poland has deprived migrants of many of the rights, and aid organizations and journalists were not allowed to enter the zone to report what was and is still happening there. And we should also mention the interim measure adopted in the past month by the European Court of Human Rights, for example, in the case RA and others versus Poland, or HMM and others versus Latvia, concerning the event at the borders of Poland and Latvia with Belarus and the access to basic services for people stranded at the border. The proposed decision of the European Commission on the legal and practical measure to address the emergency situation at the European Union external border with Belarus adopts an approach confirmed by the proposal for a regulation addressing situation of instrumentalization in the field of migration and asylum, and the proposal for a revision of the Schengen Code. So it's another crucial area of the European Union borders, and we are very happy to speak and to have an in-depth analysis of the challenges that the European Union is facing in this area with our guest speakers, Serena Giusti, Kamila, Fialkowska, and Chiara Scissa. We thank you, Serena Giusti, for being here with us. Serena Giusti is Senior Associate Research Fellow for the Russia, Caucasus and Central Asia Center at ISPI, and here at Scuola Sant'Anna she teaches International Relations, Foreign Policies Analysis, and Art and Politics. She was Lecturer of European Politics and Russian Foreign Policies at the Catholic University of Milan and of Comparative Politics at the University of Padua, visiting research in many universities in Italy and abroad. Also, she's a member of the OSCE Reflection Group on European Security Challenges at the societal level and in the Advisory Board of Human International Security. So I'm very happy to have the opportunity to debate, to discuss with Serena about this topic. She's really a great expert on the area. So thank you very much, Serena. The floor is yours, as you prefer.
So I will try very shortly to give you an idea of the situation in Belarus and also about the relation between the European Union and such. Now, Belarus is a very unique case within the post-Soviet area. Consolidated authoritarian regime. In fact, there has been in Belarus as well as a sort of verticalization of power. In 1996, when Lukashenko went to the power, he replaced the first post-Soviet legislature with a National Assembly appointed by himself, and gradually he built up an authoritarian regime, and de facto he was able to destroy the opposition, or any way to isolate any kind of opposition. And in 2004, he organized a referendum that at the end allowed Lukashenko for stay in power indefinitely. So that means that he can stay in power for life. So it's really an example of one-person authoritarian regime. How this is possible? Why in Belarus we have not assisted to strong opposition or mass protest until at least 2020, because Lukashenko was able to provide stability to the country, in the sense that Belarus has not undertaken the social and economic effects that other people in other countries suffered after the transformation and the reforms were adopted. I remember, for instance, in Poland, after the first very strong reform in economic terms, there were dramatic social effects, and the election at the end recognized the role of the former Communist Party. That seems quite a contradiction, but especially because there were these social and economic costs. This was not true in Belarus, as I said, because there was no dramatic and deep change, and therefore people were provided with still the service they used to have during the Soviet period. For instance, in Belarus, we did not have almost unemployment. All people were employed, and also let's say that the example coming from other countries. Let's think about Georgia, but also about Ukraine. They were not very much reassuring, with Russia intervening in a certain situation. So let's say that Belarus has stayed for a long time as a stable and quite calm country. What about the opposition? As I said, most of the people in Belarus are employed by the state, and therefore it's very difficult to protest and to oppose. Nevertheless, in recent years, we have assisted to an increase of employment also in the private sector. And as much as people work in the private sector, the more chance these people are able to oppose or to protest. The same phenomenon can be seen in Russia, where actually some years ago the private sector was quite important, but gradually this has been restrained. And so we cannot be so surprised that Russians, for instance, are not protesting so much against this war, because the first thing they would lose is a job, is a work, and that's not easy to take a clear stance against the war. And then there is another important element for understanding why the opposition has increased in recent years. That is the fact that social media are available in Belarus, and especially Telegram. And so Telegram became a place to find real information, especially about the pandemic, because as you may know, Lukashenko was negate the presence of the pandemic, but the effect of the pandemic were very sensed by the people. And also there was, because of the pandemic, a sort of solidarity among people. There was a creation of various associations of people helping each other to face up the effect of the pandemic. So these three elements were quite important for the creation of a sort of opposition, and they were at the basis of the protests in the summer 2020. The situation, as I say, was quite stable because of Russia influence in the economic situation of Belarus. Actually, we can say that Belarus is fully dependent on the economic support by Russia. It is also defined as a country that is subsidized by Russia, and therefore there is a very limited margin of action. So we can also say that it's quite unthinkable a change in Belarus unless Russia wanted and cut its economic support. But it's also important to underline the role of China, because China has increasingly invested in Belarus, but the same phenomenon can be seen in Ukraine, because China had important investment in energy and in the agriculture sector in Ukraine as well. And both countries, Belarus and Ukraine, are part of the Belt and Road Initiative promoted by China. So this is to say that it's quite interesting to follow how China is acting in this war in Ukraine, because actually its own economic interests were affected by the war itself. What is the role of the European Union? As you can imagine, the role of the European Union in Belarus is quite limited, is a residual and standard role in the sense that the European Union has relied on the same institutional instrument it has used regarding other post-Soviet countries and Russia itself. So the European Union has a partnership and cooperation agreement with Belarus. Belarus has been included in the European neighbor policy, a policy that the European Union has established after the 2004 big enlargement to avoid new line of division in Europe, and also is part of the Eastern Partnership, the Eastern dimension of the European neighborhood policy. But in fact, Belarus has never been an active country in these two policies, because this implies to adjust to the European Union value and legislation as well. Since the beginning, the European Union has conducted a let's say, divided approach One approach that is devoted to the leadership of the country, so basically to Lukashenko and his entourage. And another part of the policies is dedicated to people, so to civil society. And the role of the European Union has been also very important for supporting all those people still affected by the consequence of Chernobyl. So even when the European Union has adopted a very hostile attitude toward Belarus, toward the leadership of Belarus, nevertheless, has always pursued those programs devoted to people. Now, there is a change in the relation between the European Union and Belarus, and also in the domestic politics of Belarus, that is the quite huge protest which took place in summer 2020 in Belarus, in Minsk, in the capital of the country, but also outside Minsk. These were the very first mass protests that the country has seen since the end of the Soviet domination. And the protest started because people contested the outcome of the presidential election, where Lukashenko was re-elected. It's quite interesting how the European Union reacted, because again it undertook a divided approach between the leadership and again the people. But in this time, among the leadership, we have to count also the leadership of the opposition. So the European Union was targeting Lukashenko and his circle, but also was trying to support the opposition that was led by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She left the country and she still guided the opposition from outside. And in this sense, it's quite interesting to see how the European Union supported the opposition, because it reminds me a bit of also what the European Union is doing with Zelensky, with the president of Ukraine. Because the European Union, first of all, did not recognize the outcome of the election. And also, as you know, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe did not, but all the international community did not recognize, apart some exception of a country close to Russia and Belarus. And at the same time gave visibility to the opposition and treat the opposition as it was the legitimate guide of the country. So the leader of the opposition was hosted in the European Parliament in Brussels. She met all the institutional leaders of Commission, Parliament, European Council. She was invited in various European Union member states. She came to Rome as well, and she met with a politician in Rome, in France, and also, for instance, she opened the College of Europe in the year of the College of Europe in Natolin and Warsaw, that usually is opened by some important European politicians. So the fact that she was called there was de facto recognition of her role. So the European Union action can be seen through the lens of delegitimation of the leadership of the country, so delegitimation of Lukashenko. The European Union tried to mediate by what is called a back channel diplomacy, so creating a channel of communication with Lukashenko and his entourage, avoid official methods. So we can say that there was a diplomacy going on. I had the occasion to interview some people in the European delegation dealing with the case of Belarus, and they confirm, in fact, that there was this back-channel diplomacy that was not very successful. And in the case of Belarus, the European Union as well took some sections that were directed to the people at the power, so basically Lukashenko and again its circles. It was not possible so much to take economic sanction because the economic relation between the European Union and Belarus is quite limited because, as I said, Belarus' main economic trade and support is with Russia. So we see in Belarus some of the partners we see in actually in Ukraine. And here I arrive to the point that might be interesting for this morning's seminar, that is Belarus retaliation against the European Union. Because Belarus use migrants coming from actually other countries, and especially from countries affected by war as Syria, as Afghanistan. And so it was really a strategy because they organized some travels for these immigrants, and these immigrants arrived in Belarus, and then they were forced to pass the border with other European countries. So there was, in the words of the High Representative of the European Union, the instrumentalization of human beings for political purpose as a group of migrants escorted by armed Belarusian security forces, so even armed, is quite important to stress it. And these people were actually forced to cross the borders of the European Union. What happened was that some countries, and here we can see the difference of from what has happened with actually Ukrainian refugee, some European countries had a quite hard reaction. Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia reinforced their border protection and put in place some controversial extra-legal emergency measure as the restriction of journalists' access to the border, the temporary legalization of migrants' pushback, as well as stark restriction on the right of asylum seekers. Even for journalists, I again had the chance to talk to some journalists, and actually they find it very difficult to arrive to the border and to speak to these migrants. So let's say that the behavior of this country was not very in line with the value and the principle of the European Union. And we have to ask ourselves why, and why the attitude towards Ukrainian was so difficult. So it seems so contrasting the fact that instead the European Union regarding the crisis in Ukraine, the migrants crisis, was able quite shortly and in a compact way to agree on a temporary protection directive, as Francesca has talked about. So this directive became immediately applicable to the people of Ukraine. Yeah, I think I can just add that at the same time, the European Union was able to support people to Belarus in line with this sort of tripartite approach. So I will stop here with this introduction to the case of Belarus. I'm very ready to answer your question if there will be later on. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Serena, for your presentation, for your in-depth analysis, and this very interesting introduction on the political also perspective of this situation. And I give the floor to our second speaker, Dr. Kamila Fialkowska, researcher at the Center of Migration Research, University of Warsaw, a research focused on migration from Poland, inequalities, gender, religion, and national and ethnic identities. Since the border and humanitarian crisis on the Polish-Belarusian border, she has been involved in the work of the research collective Researcher on the Border. Thank you very much for your availability, and the floor is yours, Kamila.
Thank you very much for. Do you hear me all right? Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
We will.
Thank you for an invite and for this kind introduction. I must say that my research focus has shifted in the last couple of months towards the border and the situation, the humanitarian situation there. I will try now to share my screen.
Yeah.
And I wonder how do I do that? Let me try. Okay, that should be it. Just let me know if you see it.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so I can go full screen now. Okay, so thank you again. And when I got the invitation to this seminar, to this conference, I was already on the borderland, so to say, near to the Polish-Belarusian border, and I thought that maybe it will be interesting for you if I give you a little bit of an impression of how it looks like these days, with the reflection on the previous months. And it is great that the previous speaker ended up with the brief introduction to the situation on the border and the escalation of the border conflict with Belarus. Yes, I will focus on this humanitarian aspect mostly. And as we have already 8 months of the crisis, I think it is important to stress that this is not the over of the crisis. It's still continuing. And I just wanted to add that I worked on this material also with Katarzyna Winiarska, who is a PhD student at the University of Warsaw. We've been together in the last couple of weeks for several times in the Białowieża forest, and that's also her reflections here. So let me begin with and kind of pick up on what was said in the previous presentation, how it started and how it's going. So we all kind of know that the last year, as a result of the sanction or as a reaction to the sanctions imposed by the EU on Lukashenko, he kind of announced that his reaction would be to actually send illegal migrants across the border and destabilize the situation. And obviously, he didn't get this idea out of nowhere. We already knew how Europe reacted to so-called refugee crisis of 2015. And we already know that we are in the continuous process of building Fortress Europe. So Europe is afraid of migrants that are not necessarily welcomed. And it's easily to threaten Europe with arrival of numbers of this kind of people who are considered unwanted. And so that's what exactly happened. In Poland, we observed that since August, but it happened earlier in the Baltic states. So in August, we observed the situation in one of the villages on the border with Belarus. It was this movement obviously was orchestrated by Belarus, by bringing people to Belarus and then moving them further west through Poland to other EU member states. And this process is characterized or is defined as weaponizing on migrants, weaponizing on migration, and it led on the other side of this process. It led to militarizing the border. So the Polish response to it was to actually put the razor wire fence all along the border. Now we are in the process of building sort of a wall, and the construction has started and it continues. The plans are to finish it by the end of this year. But obviously, this weaponizing on migration and militarization of the border, fortification of the border, leads to humanitarian crisis on this very border, on this area. As it happens, we observe various reactions of the civil society and of the state response, and the way the state responds to it. And what is our perspective of the researchers who observe this process, of lawyers, but also of the civil society actors? These are attempts to legalize illegality. But these attempts are not isolated, and they are not unique within the European Union, because I think that European Union is not a paradise. It's not a place where the so-called EU values are respected and cherished. I think actually one of the EU values currently is actually to build Fortress Europe. So these values are being respected by much of the European member states, including Poland, including Italy, including Greece, including Hungary. Those states are doing exactly the same things. This is the part that is happening on the so-called Eastern European route. So it's not much different from what is happening elsewhere, really. And this kind of legalizing illegality attempts have been actually applauded by the European Union. They have not been condemned. So the Ursula von der Leyen, for instance, already in September, said that this is a hybrid attack, this is a hybrid war announced by the Belarusian regime, that people are not bargaining chips and we are not allowed for it, but we firmly stand behind Poland and the Baltic states. So basically, it was wholeheartedly supported by the EU and by the and it was understood that it is a rationality that has to be done. The border has to be protected. The European Union has to be protected. What Lukashenko is doing is illegal, so on and so forth. So this new situation was actually, and also this justification was readily picked up by the Polish government. And it was understood that, yes, this is a hybrid threat, this is a hybrid war. And so this is not a regular situation that we are having on other sort of natural migration routes. So as this is the man-made crisis, we are open to bring up here new solutions. And these new solutions were implemented very early on, from 2nd of September, and then following months, there was a state of emergency introduced in the border zone. And now there's sort of no-go zone that most likely will be extended by the end of June. There were amendments to the national law regarding the legalizing illegal expulsions, illegal pushbacks. And there's been also a criminalization of humanitarian assistance. So people who were self-organizing and mobilizing their resources to provide humanitarian aid on the ground. So how it started? It started like this, and how it's going. So-called defending the border, but also having the crisis and deepening the crisis, and providing humanitarian aid is pretty much summed up on the second picture on the right. You see here traces on the snow. These are the traces of the humanitarian aid volunteers who are actually heading to the forest to provide help. So nothing has changed, really. The scale has changed because the scale is not as high, as big as it was in October, in November. But there are still several hundreds of people stranded in the woods. There are several hundreds of people on the Belarusian side. And even though the flights are not arriving to Minsk as frequently as they did before, people arrive through Moscow. So I will maybe now take you to the forest and tell you a little bit about the traces and how we work. So the very definition of the traces is a mark, a sign of something being in one location or the other, of following the traces to try to answer what happens, where the traces leads us, and how do we interpret them. And following the traces is critically important in the context of providing humanitarian aid and basically helping refugees and migrants to survive in the forest. Why do we follow the traces? We have a few very different actors on the borderlands. So-called defenders of the borders. So these are the border guards, police, army, territorial defense units. We have the refugees, or otherwise speaking, people on the move. We have local and non-local activists who are present on the borderland. And all those three groups, they produce, but they also follow the traces for very different reasons. And so the practice and theory differs when we take the perspective of each of those groups. So-called defenders of the border, they officially want to prevent illegal crossing of the border. They want to enforce the law, which is produced ad hoc. They want to prevent law violation. From our perspective, they are breaking international law, the international human rights law. They are doing illegal pushbacks. The refugees, the people on the move, they basically want to survive. They break the national law from the perspective of the defenders and cross the border in irregular manner. They are escaping. It is a multiple escape. It is escape from their countries of origin, from the regions of origin. It is escape from Belarus. It is escape from the border guards. Sometimes it is escape from activists because they don't know who is actually approaching. And as for the local and non-local activists, because people who live locally, quite a few of them are involved from the very beginning. There's also a lot of people arriving from all over Poland, but also from outside of Poland to this region to support these efforts. And their perspective is to save lives, to provide humanitarian aid, basic humanitarian aid, to not break the law. They refer to the basic definition of help, that if you see someone dying, it's your legal obligation to actually provide help. They are also, from the perspective of the defenders of the border, they're accused of smuggling the human beings. So basically, there are a few different perspectives that are all met in this borderland. And this is how it looks like. It can the view of the forest, the perspective in the forest can differ within hours, within days. So in beginning of April, there was a heavy snowfall, but a couple of days later, it looked exactly like on the second picture. And this is the last primeval forest in Europe, and surviving there is really difficult. For people who are coming from quite different geographical locations, many of them have not seen such forests in their entire life. So it is challenging. Walking through it for just a few hours leaves you really exhausted. So very often when we are there as an activist, when we get information, what do people need if you are able to help them? The reported needs are barely to survive. And then we ask details. What do you need exactly? Are you in pain? Do you need medical help in the forest? Do you need some food? Do you need sleeping bags? So on and so forth. But this is something that we are often faced with, is just help us to survive. And so on my last, when I last went to the Białowieża forest, I was participating in one of the intervention. We were about to help a group of Yemeni who were on the Polish side. It was the intervention that was without snow, so it was relatively easy to walk, although the road was totally impassable. There were a lot of fallen trees. It took us quite a few hours to actually get to the location that we were sent. But on this location, we found nobody. We only found some traces. So that's why traces are critically important. You need to search for them. You need to look for them. You need to know how to look for them. It's easier to look for them when there's, for instance, snow, but it's not so easy to look for them when the forest is green or when it is raining, because the traces kind of dissolve in the water. So we only found some few things left on the ground. Just to give you an impression, it is an amazingly beautiful place. But when you know what you're doing there, when you know what's the reason of you being there, it is also quite scary and frightful. And we moved to the only direction that was possible, that was passable also. And because we knew that one person had problems walking, we also kind of realized that, okay, that by this logic, the person possibly walked through the easiest possible direction. So we tried to kind of think, okay, how would they go? Where would they go? And that led us to another sort of empty campsite. And there are several places like this in the forest. Some people say it's rubbish. Some people say it's evidence of humanitarian crisis, of what is happening there. And here we found, beside the belongings of the people, we found few papers that were kind of lying down on the grass. And also for security reasons, usually we collect those papers. They contain personal data, so we don't want them to be left out there. And when we are back in the base, we try to see what's there, to try to kind of disentangle them and find out, okay, what do they tell us about the persons that we were trying to find? Obviously, these were not the papers of the Yemeni, because we have never found the Yemenis. They have somehow disappeared. But we found the papers of somebody else's presence. We found the traces of somebody else's presence in the forest. And we try to find out what they tell us. When we were on this campsite, there's also in a good condition, but some of them were destroyed intentionally. So people know that there are living signs. People know that there are living some evidence of their presence. Some of them they don't care about. Some of them they try to destroy, not to be found. So that's also the question: what was actually happening to the people we have coincidentally met, or not even met, whose traces we have found on the ground. So, for instance, one of the things that was coincident, it is kind of coincidental with the pandemic, because currently everyone had to do the COVID test, or in the last couple of months. So, for instance, one paper was about the COVID test, and from this COVID test, we could read the personal data of the person, the country of origin, the very date this test was taken, the very place this test was taken, and it was from October. So, obviously, when we are there in the forest, we were instantly thinking, okay, what does it mean? Does it lie here for a couple of weeks only, or for a couple of months already? We don't know how much time does it take for the paper to dissolve in humidity. To the point of becoming unreadable. But yet at the time we were still looking for this Yemenis, so we kind of grabbed these papers and pack and we had to move on. But when we tried to, sorry, I think I didn't show you the screen, the presentation. So that's the campsite. I'm sorry for that. I got carried on. And yeah, these are the shreds that we were kind of trying to read and make sense of later on. These are some of the destroyed papers that we were not able to even find out what were they about. That's the COVID test that was found on the ground near to the papers. And that's our attempt to find out what these papers were actually telling us. So they start in Cuba. The person was from Cuba. We know that we read that he had to take a COVID test before going abroad. His flight was to Moscow on 14th of October. Then on 18th, there was evidence of him transferring money from Moscow to Germany to his partner and the child. Then we know that he had to take a medical checkup. This is the test that we found, this one from 19th October in the forest. On 21st of October, he was already in Minsk, where he bought SIM cards. He exchanged the money. And that's quite interesting, because on the 20th of November, he was supposed to fly from Moscow to Cuba. But obviously that flight took on without him. And we know that only 2 days after, he was again in Minsk, where he transferred money to Germany again. And that was the last paper that we could identify with the last date from Minsk. We know that the person was for sure in the Białowieża forest on the Polish side, because on the 15th of March, we found the remaining documents in the forest. And by coincidence, in April, we found out that he's in detention. And that's where we are left with the story. And we're still wondering whether we should contact the person and ask about his explanation, his interpretation of what happened, or should we just leave it like that? And just to conclude, it is quite important to put it in perspective. Yes, that's important what's happening on the Ukrainian border, but how it kind of puts the situation on the Belarusian border in the totally different light, or it kind of emphasizes the problems that we are facing on the Belarusian border, and maybe we can interpret why we are facing them on this border and why we do not face them on the border with Ukraine. So on the tweet, which is in Polish, and I can briefly give you an idea what it's about, on the 10th of April, in the early morning, in one of the locations on the border, a group of foreigners have crossed it illegally. They were stopped. There were 6 Yemenis, 4 Syrians, and 1 person from Sudan. And only in this month, which is 10th day of the month, only in this month there were already 300 attempts to illegally cross the border, recorded by the border guards. Of course, there are probably more, but the 300 were recorded, and they talk about it, that they prevented that attempts. And that next week, it's from the 12th to 18th of April, the border group, the coalition of NGOs and independent activists were called to help 180 people, among them 36 children. What's changed now is that these the last weeks shows that these are the very vulnerable groups. The women, the children, wounded, elderly people, people with disabilities. Basically, people for whom it is really difficult to make the crossing, people who don't have money to pay for transfer to the West, people who are desperate to cross the border because they've spent, some of them, they spent a couple of months in Belarus already. And that's what we are, that's what I basically wanted to tell you today. That's what we are observing with the collective researchers on the border, and here you have also the email address and Facebook and Twitter. Please reach us if you are interested in our work and want to find out more about the situation on the borderland. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for the trouble with the presentation. I thought it's moving.
Thank you so much, Kamila, for this presentation and for your impressive research activity. Really interesting and really in close connection with the lives of people, the protection of their fundamental rights. So yeah, it's really interesting also to come back on this point during the debate. And now we move to the third presentation of this session, Chiara Scissa. Chiara is a PhD student in law at the Scuola Sant'Anna of Advanced Studies, where she is specializing on environmental migration. She actively collaborates at the Environmental Migration Hub within the DREAM research area and serves as external peer review for the upcoming UNESCO's Resilience Report on Small Developing Island. She was visiting research fellow at IOM Regional Office in Vienna, Migration, Environmental and Climate Change Division, as well as Policy and Liaison Division. Thank you very much, Chiara. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Biondi Dal Monte, and I really would like to thank all of you for being here, either in presence or online. And I really would like to thank also Professor Kaczmarczyk and Dr. Fialkowska for being with us. So today I'm going to briefly illustrate the EU emergency response to the migration plight at the EU-Belarus border. And since we have already seen the emergency response that EU is giving to Ukraine, I'm also going to evaluate and to compare the 2 emergency responses. So, first of all, it seems like we have 2 different borders in Poland. We have a first border, the one between Poland and Ukraine, which, as previous speakers told us, is open. More than, or at almost 3 million people fled Ukraine and headed and entered, have been welcome in Poland. And then we have a second border, the one between Poland and Belarus. This border is completely closed. We have a 5-meter high wall, we have fences, and we have the military deployed along the border in order to stop people, prevent people to enter in Poland from Belarus. And as previous speakers highlighted, here we have, between Poland and Belarus, we have a buffer zone, no man's land, if you want. So people are stuck in there, are stranded in there with no access to food, water, shelter, clothes, and not even to first aid, given that humanitarian and medical NGOs have been forbidden to enter this zone. Is that because of numbers? Is that because the number of people fleeing Belarus and entering Poland was so great, was so huge that Poland couldn't manage this migration flow? Well, I don't think the answer lies in there, since as of end November 2021, and please note that this number is outdated, and IOM already denounced that there are no updated numbers regarding the presence of people stranded between Belarus and the EU. But as November 2021, we had less than 8,000 people who managed to enter the EU from Belarus, plus around 10,000 people stranded at the border. So this means less than 20,000 people who either managed to enter the EU or are stranded at the EU-Belarus border. So we are very far from a crisis. For instance, just think about the famous refugee crisis of 2015, when hundreds of thousands of migrants reached the EU. Plus, the main nationalities of people coming from Belarus to Poland, in this case, are from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. So conflict-torn countries, as unfortunately Ukraine is right now. The majority of these people headed to Lithuania, then Poland and Latvia. And of course, if the number of arrivals arises, of course, also the number of international protection claims arises. But again, as of January 2022, so this number is a bit more updated, a total number of less than 11,000 international protection claims have been lodged in Lithuania, Poland, and Latvia. Of course, there has been a huge increase in the number of international protection claims lodged in these countries because they are not used to be countries of destinations of migration, international protection seekers flows, geographically speaking, but also because of their strong anti-migrant sentiment. And still, this is not a crisis. If you think about it, only in Italy, only in 2016, the Italian authorities registered 143,000 international protection claims. Here we are talking about less than 11,000 in 3 countries of the European Union. This is far from being a crisis, in my opinion. Now we are ready to compare the emergency response that the EU is giving to Ukraine versus Belarus. So, regarding Ukraine, we have already seen this with Professor Francesca Biondi Dal Monte. For the very first time, the EU activated the Temporary Protection Directive, which is human rights based. The goal of the directive is to protect people, to assist people, and therefore, here we can see temporary protection holders are granted with a residence permit, with the right to work, the right to family reunification, the right to education, the right to housing, the right to healthcare. This is not what happened with Belarus. In December 2021, the Commission issued a proposal for a Council decision to implement emergency, temporary and exceptional measures for Lithuania, Latvia and Poland. So even from the title, we can understand that the goal of the Commission is completely different, because in Ukraine, we have the attention on people. Here in Belarus, we have the focus on member states. The goal of the Commission is to support the member states in order to address the so-called instrumentalization of migration. Migrants are part of the Habitat Act set forth by Belarus, but are not the main aim of the Commission in this case. And in fact, the Commission suggests to derogate from the ordinary norms of migration and asylum, and to support the member states by letting them extend the registration of international protection claims, applying the border procedure to all people coming from Belarus, including minors. This means that people must remain at the border in order for their international protection claim to be accessed. Only if the outcome of the evaluation of their international protection claim is positive, they can enter the EU. Otherwise, if the outcome is negative, they are already at the border to be removed. And this time has been also extended up to 4 months, which is a lot. And finally, the Commission suggests to provide different material reception conditions. And in the absence of a definition of what different material reception conditions might be, in my opinion, this can just be translated into a lower standard, as indeed is still already happening. So I think the comparison is clear here. The scope of the Commission here is to support the member states. But we have more. The Commission adds 2 other proposals, a proposal for an instrumentalization of regulation. So if we add a mechanism to address the extraordinary situation of the instrumentalization of migration to the 2 other mechanisms set forth in the new pact in order to derogate from the ordinary measures, the ordinary norms in asylum and migration because of a situation of crisis or force majeure, we have an ordinary mechanism and then already 3 whole exceptionary derogative mechanisms. And finally, we have the proposal to amend the Schengen Border Code also in order to include specific measures to adopt in order to respond to the instrumentalization of migrants. Also here, you can see no reference to the protection of migrants, the assistance to migrants, the respect of their human rights, the respect to their rights to asylum. But in the end, in my opinion, nothing of this really matters because none of these proposals have yet been adopted. So basically, if you think about it, the EU emergency response to the benefit, this is important, to the benefit of migrants stranded at the EU-Belarus border simply, of course, in my opinion, does not exist. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Chiara. Thank you very much for your presentation, for your clear presentation. So we can open the debate about these 3 presentations for this panel. We can collect questions, please. Yeah, Kamila, Galitz, please, if you can come here. Also from people online, if you have any question, raise your hand or simply write in chat.
So thank you for the speakers. I skipped my presentation because
thank you.
Okay, I have a question to Chiara mainly. So what, in my opinion, is absent also in this case, and also in the case connected to the Afghan crisis, is the presence of EU agencies. So only in case of Ukraine, as Professor Francesca Biondi Dal Monte highlighted, only Romania requested for the presence, for the involvement of EU agencies. The other member states have not. And I just want to ask for your opinion. It's up to the member states to ask for the involvement. But how can member states be a bit more motivated to request the involvement? Because we know that, for example, in the case of the 2015-16 crisis, in Greek hotspots and also in Italian hotspots, the EU agencies, also the Frontex or this, at that time the EASO, were actively involved in the management of the situation. So if you can a bit expand your opinion in this regard, I would be grateful for that. Thank you.
Other question? I have a couple of questions. Serena, please.
This is just a curiosity for our Polish speaker. Is there any debate in Poland about the different treatment of these migrants to the country? And is there any kind of politicization in terms of position taken by the major political parties? Thank you.
Thank you, Serena. I have many questions, but the first one, Serena, I was wondering if the instrumentalization of migrants at the borders of the European Union was a direct consequence of the approach of the European Union towards the new election of Lukashenko, or there are maybe other reasons related also to the influence of Russia to Belarus, or maybe in light also of the planned war to Ukraine. I don't know if. And I also have a question for Chiara. I was wondering if you think that the temporary protection directive could be activated also regarding the protection of people at the border of Belarus, or maybe we are not in a situation of max influx. And what do you think about the definition of max influx? For example, the references to a specific country or geographical area. And the third, for our colleague from Poland, Kamila Fialkowska, I'm really interested in your research, and I hope that we will be in touch also in order to read the result of your research on the field, on the border. And I was wondering if you have specific analysis also regarding the condition of children on the border. Yeah, this module, Mass Migration, Asylum and Right of Minors, is devoted to the right of minors, migrant children in particular. And yeah, I was wondering if you have specific result or elements related to the condition of family with children and children maybe unaccompanied, also minors at the border. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that we can maybe, if there is other question, well, yeah, Chiara, the first, yes, and then Serena.
Thank you very much for your questions. So I will start to answer to Kamila. So first of all, in the Council's proposal, the Commission suggests also a great involvement of all agents, or all EU agencies with a mandate on migration and asylum. I really don't understand how this involvement would work, because the Commission in the proposal is very vague. So they simply suggest that the Commission simply suggests their involvement, but without any specificities. Also, Poland rejected multiple times the involvement of Frontex in managing the crisis between, of course, the Polish and Belarusian border, while Lithuania asked and received the help from Frontex. But it was the only EU member states involved in this to ask Frontex help. As for temporary protection, well, of course, if the temporary protection directive will could be flexibly activated, of course, this will be would provide a huge support to people stranded at the EU-Belarus border. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening because of the mass influx definition. We've seen that, for instance, the directive has been activated in the context of the Ukrainian conflict when hundreds of thousands of people have been already entered in the EU. Here we are talking about, again, like 20,000 people. So I don't think that could qualify as a max influx. Also, they are coming from different geographical locations, but this obstacle, in my opinion, can be overcome if we take Belarus as the third country where all these people at the end come from. But again, we have still the obstacle of a mass influx. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chiara.
Yes, I think, I mean, a posteriori it's difficult to say, but at the moment when these migrants start to flow towards Poland, the other country, the first hypothesis was that this was a sort of retaliation, weaponization of migrants by Lukashenko to respond to the support of European member states and the European Union as such to the protest, and also to the sanction that the European Union have decided. Actually, at that point was not even clear the position of Russia. Now I would say that Putin was really supporting Lukashenko, because there was also the rumors that probably Putin was actually in favor of a change in the power in Lukashenko, finding someone still very close to Russia, but different from Lukashenko, that was judged not able to control the situation. But after what we have seen in Ukraine, probably this is not so true. Okay.
Thank you, Serena. And then Kamila, Fialkowska.
Yes, thank you for the questions. As for the debate on the different treatment and the different realities on those two borders, yes, there are debates, obviously, because it is striking. It is very confusing for some people. For some people, it's very straightforward. But it's complicated for me to also sum up the discussion, because I would have to go back to a couple of years before, to the so-called refugee crisis and also Islamophobic campaign that was started in much of the European member states, including Poland. And that was very clear how we define people from outside of the European Union, or people people who are Muslims, and how we portrayed Islam in the European culture. And that's something that is very important in this context. In 2015, we had the parliamentary election in the middle of the so-called refugee crisis. And this parliamentary election, a lot of candidates have openly called for not welcoming refugees and not letting Poland to become Islamized. So there was call for to stop Islamization of Poland, as if it was already happening, which is obviously a fake, which is obviously kind of a myth that the right-wing politicians are actively promoting, that they are like that there's something that is happening. It is something that is happening in the Western Europe, something that is happening in Germany or in Sweden. It's quite present and vivid in at least on the Polish right-wing side of the political scene. There's also a lot of politicians who have been present and actively present on the border. I'm not going to name them because there's quite a lot of them, and Probably I will miss some important figures. 1 p.m. tried to open her office in the no-go zone. She was not allowed, she was not let in because there was no go zone. So basically, she was rejected entry. I know that now she's again about to arrive for this coming weekend to the no-go zone, and we'll see if the police will let her in. Obviously, she's a recognized figure and active on the side of the humanitarian aid and helping also. Herself being in the forest several times, so she's known for being she's identified on one side of this conflict. So there are discussions about it, and there are also some diagnoses how to explain this difference. And one of this diagnosis is that yes, there's obviously a reason why Ukrainians are so warmly welcomed in Poland. It is our neighbor. We have huge history, long history. There is an economic migration of which Paweł was talking in his presentation, and this massive, really long-lasting links with Ukrainian people who are living in Poland. And also this, it is about the definition of the situation. It is clear and very understandable for us and for majority of Poles to identify who is the oppressor and who is the oppressed. In the case, and I guess that on the very basic psychological level, it helps to identify and helps to kind of say, okay, obviously we want to help. But when it comes to the Belarusian border and when it comes to the situation there, it's beginning to be much more complicated for average citizen. So here we have again this the legacy of this Islamophobic campaign. The legacy of dehumanizing and racializing migrants from other parts of the world, especially from Middle East, for instance. And the definition of the situation is quite complex. We don't have a state that is, for instance, acting on behalf of Yemenis or Syrians or I don't know, or Afghans. People don't identify with those states. While people from Ukraine identify with the state of Ukraine, they fight for the state. While in those other parts where the war-torn countries are in the conflict for several decades, when there's a civil war, there's no clear definition of the situation. It's very difficult also for the average citizen to say, okay, so why don't you defend your country as the Ukrainians do? And it's actually working in favor of the Ukrainians, but it puts the people from other conflict-torn countries in bad light, because these are very often men, very often young men who are fleeing. And if you compare them with the refugees from Ukraine, obviously the general perception is that, yes, these people are fleeing, but these people are fighting. And these are only single moms, mothers with children who are fleeing Ukraine. So that's, you know, the perception of the refugees is again being manipulated. And we have this change that actually shows us who is deserving of a refugee, who is deserving of a protection, and who is not. And that also is used against the people stranded on the Belarusian border, and against, for that matter, other people who are trying to enter the European Union from many other points. So there is a lot of discussions, there is a lot of sides in the discussions, there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of doubts that people are having. And there's a lot of propaganda also that is using certain arguments against especially people from outside of the EU, from and not from the Ukraine, from Yemen, from Syria, from Afghanistan, or from Congo or Sudan, for that matter. What about the condition of the children? This is something that I really don't know. Really, I am. The children are there are a lot of families now that are obviously with the families who are crossing the border. The attempts are made by the humanitarian aid workers not to put them in the detention center, in the closed detention center. They try to move the families to the open facilities, which is not easy. There are at least few cases of unaccompanied minors in the Polish facilities for children, and it is uncertain what will happen to them. At least for the time being, there are few of them are in the for a couple of months now in such facilities. Some of them are speaking pretty well Polish at this time. That's what I heard from my last stay in Białowieża first. And this is something that is also very troubling because we know that the families with children are among one of the most vulnerable groups that are crossing the border and having a lot of experience with pushbacks. So that's also about the psychological conditions of those families and of those children, and how much of the support they will be able to get while they're in detention, and how their case will be decided. That's something to be seen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamila. So thank you, and we will move to the third panel with Serena.
Okay, we start immediately with the third section, as we are running out of time. And the third section is dedicated to the situation in Afghanistan. You all know that Afghanistan has been invaded by Soviet Union, and then there was the support by other actor of Mujahideen. This actor was the US, Pakistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, China, and the UK. And then the Soviet Union left Afghanistan in 1989 without having the possibility to get the control of the country. And almost 10 years after, there was a new intervention by US and UK, and this time was again Taliban. There was also the presence of NATO until 2020. So last summer, when after a peace, 2021, when after a peace agreement between the US and the Taliban, it was decided that the Western powers would have left the country, but we all know and we all have in mind the image of the catastrophe of living Afghanistan in such a way. So I really immediately leave the floor to Naided Fayez. She's currently a PhD student in human rights and global politics here at the Scuola Sant'Anna. And in 2014, she completed her master's degree in public policy and management and KDI School in South Korea. And she's a former UN staff in Afghanistan. For more than 10 years, she was then working with the UN. And she worked in particular with Women Empower and Gender Equality program. Naid, she's going to give a presentation about the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. So I see that Naid is already connected with us. So please, I leave the floor to you, Naid.
Okay, thank you. Okay, you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me at this seminar, and thanks for giving me this chance to talk about situation in Afghanistan under Taliban rule. Okay, let's start. First, I would like to show you some pictures here to give you an idea about the situation before Taliban. At least we have I can say achievement during 2 decades in Afghanistan, but unfortunately we totally lost all these achievements since Taliban seized power in August 2021. You see that we had parliament, we had judicial system, we had army, including women, we had actually freedom of media, and also we had women rights in Afghanistan, freedom of rights in many aspects like music, like education, employment, sports, everything. But since Taliban came to power, we lost all these things. Okay, first I want to tell you about the Taliban, and it's better to understand who are the Taliban and what they want. I can say that Taliban emerged in civil war that followed the withdrawal of Soviet troops in 1989, and they are created by America, but by US, and they are in the form of mujahideen. They were in the form of mujahideen that fight against Soviet occupation. They're actually predominantly Pashtun people. We have in Afghanistan different ethnic groups. As you see in the map, Taliban came from west, south and west part of east part of Afghanistan, the border of Pakistan. They grew at this part, and they believe in hardline interpretation of Islamic law, Islam Sharia law, and they want to restore the strict approach to the governance of Afghanistan. So you can see also here the picture of the Taliban here. They're in the Kabul city, or you see here they're in the border of Pakistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Here you see also the Taliban cabinet. We call it cabinet of terrorists. Now Afghanistan is ruled by this kind of people, by terrorist group of Taliban. There are even UN declare that 14 members of Taliban are in the list of UN blacklist. You see the leader of the Taliban that we actually don't know he's alive or not, and the prime minister and both deputies belongs to the blacklist, UN blacklist. They're all terrorists, and you might also hear about Haqqani, Sirajuddin Haqqani, that now he's a minister, interior minister, and he's the head of Haqqani network in Afghanistan, and he's famous for suicide bombers all around the world. And also America called him as a blacklist, as a group of blacklists. So you see these people currently they are ruling the country, and their entire male, you cannot see any women inside this now we want to see the situation under Taliban rule. According to UN, nearly 400 civilians have been killed. These civilians came from those working with NATO or working with previous government. The Taliban, they are just arrest them with any excuse and kill them. And according to UN, poverty rate by end of October 2021 was 72%, but it's expected that the rate is increasing to 98% by middle of this year. More than half of population, is about 23 million Afghans, are now suffering the extreme level of hunger, and we also have an increasing rate of child labor, child marriage, and also sale of children that people in Afghanistan people are now doing because of surviving, because they want to be survived. And many people, Afghan people, they lost many jobs. And also, according to UN, it's expected that 700,000 job losses will be by end of this year. Afghanistan system, finance system, Afghanistan economy has collapsed. You know that Afghanistan economy is extremely aid-dependent economy, and 40% of GDP was international aid. So many countries like US and Germany, they suspended the international aid to the government. Sorry. Also, nearly 70% of all Afghan media outlets closed. Many journalists fled the country, and those who remain in Afghanistan, they cannot show up, and they are just afraid of their security. Millions of people are displaced, and Afghan health system is near to the collapse because many Afghanistan people, they deny access to primary emergency service health system because of the insecure situation in Afghanistan right now. Hunger crisis, and I put some pictures to show you this situation, the humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, hunger is rising and children are dying. And according to UN, again, 3.2 million children under age 5 are expected to suffer by end of this year. And you see that this winter, Afghan people were forced to select between immigration and starvation. And most children, those who are under 5 years, are worse affected because they are more vulnerable. And many Afghan peoples also, they bring their belongings to the street, to the market to survive. And also many of women, they begging in front of the bakery for bread. So this is the current situation in Afghanistan. Security crisis also, beside the problems in Afghanistan, a bombing explosion is still going on. And the Taliban, they mostly attack Shia community, and the Hazara ethnic group belongs to Shia community. So they attack them, they want to, I can say, genocide them, and they attacked mosques, schools, Hazara peoples. On October 8th, it was a picture of a mosque in Kunduz, Kunduz mosque that many people killed and many injured. And 1 week after, it was another explosion in Kandahar city. And very recently, on April 19, there was suicide bombers near the school, Hazara or Shia community school, that had at least 30 students died and more than 100 injured. International displaced crisis. Before Taliban seized power, about 2.9 million, which is 7% of population, people internally displaced. But after Taliban took the power, the number increased, and Taliban, and I can say that it caused to 3.5 million people that were displaced. Here also you see that those people who internally displaced from the north part of Afghanistan, this picture is 2 days before Taliban seized power, but still internally displaced is going on, and people, they're trying to, because explosion is everywhere in Afghanistan, and they're trying to find a safe place to live. Refugee crisis, you might hear about evacuation in Afghanistan. Those people were working with NATO and also with US. Some of them were evacuated. More than 123 million civilian evacuated. 123,000 were evacuated by US only, and most of people, they are they are still waiting outside of Kabul airport, and they are waiting for evacuation, but Taliban restricted access to airports, and people are still waiting to evacuate it. And those people who evacuated are in reception center, in processing center, in many countries like Germany, like Spain, like Qatar and Uzbekistan. And many millions of people, they also could cross the border, Afghanistan border with Iran and also Pakistan. They fled the country. With Taliban take over the country, women are worse affected by this situation. And women don't access to education. University for women, for girls are closed. And recently Taliban announced that 3 days university will be open for men and just 3 days a week for women. So they separate men and women. And secondary school or girls, school for girls about 6th grade also have been closed, and Taliban said they haven't decided yet because they are planning for it, and they want to introduce some regulation or maybe code dress or etc. Jobless across most sectors, especially for women. It's about if I just focus on media, 40% of Afghan media have been closed. That includes 80% of women that doesn't they lost their job. Freedom of movement. Taliban said that for women traveling more than 72 kilometers, they shouldn't be offered a ride if they are not accompanied by a male relative, and they stress on it that it should be a very close member of the family, male relative. Also, violence against women and girls was extremely high in Afghanistan, but recently, because women cannot access to justice services, so the violence increased, and the providers, they are threatened by Taliban, and the women locked at home, and they cannot access, and they are just afraid for their safety. Healthcare in Afghanistan, especially for pregnant women, also is a big concern because of many issues like insecurity, like use of mahram. Mahram is close family members accompanied by women can be accompanied just by mahram or by a close family members. And also because of long distance to reach to health services, lack of transportation, all these issues made women very limited access to the health system. Here you see Taliban decision, Taliban court, they have their own practice. It's kind of punishment for Afghanistan people. They are still have like barbaric practices. You see they lashing journalists or protesters, and also they cutting hand for robbery if they commit any robbery, and or stoning women. They just put women in a hole inside a stony ground, and you see just head pokes above the surface, and they're starting to rock the lady until she dies. And also hanging out the dead body in public, and we don't know this person what he did, but as I already said, Taliban just punish people with any excuse, and they just hanging the dead body to the public in the public. But beside all this situation, bad situation in Afghanistan, we have still some hope. We see that people, especially women in Afghanistan, they are protesting every day. They are demanding their rights for education, for employment. And women, most of women activists, unfortunately, they taken from the home by Taliban and abducted by Taliban, actually. And after speaking out, some of them have already released, but still some of them are still in Taliban custody. And even the released women, they're are not able to talk and to share what happened to them during the Taliban custody because of, or maybe due to intense suffering they experience. And this picture was the protesting of Afghanistan people in Kabul, and we have also some women protesting, Afghan protesting in abroad. Those people who came to the street and demand their right and are protesting against Strazzari genocide. We also have a national resistance group in Afghanistan. This national resistance group comprised by different ethnic groups from Tajik, from Hazara, from Uzbek. All people came together and they are fighting against Taliban. And the group is led by the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, Ahmad Massoud. Ahmad Shah Massoud, you might know him. He was actually a guerrilla commander and he was a politician during the Soviet occupation in 1989, and he actually tried to warn the world about Al-Qaeda, but unfortunately 2 days before 9/11, he was assassinated by two Al-Qaeda reporters posing as reporters. So these people are still fighting against Taliban and are in north part of Afghanistan. Okay, thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Nahid, for your presentation that I think is also very touching for you to talk about your own country. And also I thank you for having accompanied your word with image that help us to better understand the dramatic situation. Now I will leave the floor to the next speaker. That is Francesca Romano Partipilo. She's a PhD student at the Scuola Sant'Anna and visiting researcher at Utrecht University. She graduated in law from the University of Trento and worked as a researcher at the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in London. She's voluntary in a refugee camp in Greece and at the British Refugee Council. Her research lies at the intersection of refugee law, the law of the sea, and the international human rights law. Thank you, Francesca, for being with us. I have to apologize, but unfortunately, I have two other seminars today, so I have to leave now, and Francesca will replace me in coordinating this last section. Thank you very much.
was already strained and extremely concerning. A significant proportion of the population in Afghanistan was food insecure, and harmful traditional practices, as already been illustrated, continue to determine serious violations of women's human rights and children's rights. Therefore, we can understand how Afghanistan is considered to be the most protracted refugee crisis in the world. And as reported by the High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, we are now seeing a third generation of Afghan children born in exile, so outside their own country. Currently, there are almost 2.6 million refugees, Afghan refugees around the world, of whom 2.2 million are hosted in Iran and Pakistan. In addition, there are approximately 3 million IDPs, internally displaced persons in Afghanistan, who are people who fled their homes but who still find themselves in Afghanistan. 80% of all recently displaced Afghans are women and children. So in view of what I just said, we can really understand how their living conditions are extremely dire, extremely precarious, and they are particularly vulnerable in a geographical area in which women's rights are not particularly protected. The situation after August further deteriorated. According to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, just in 2021, there were 700,000 more internally displaced people, and these people are extremely vulnerable to the consequences of the economic crisis, which has been triggered by the Taliban takeover. So I was saying, outside Afghanistan, the two major places where Afghani refugees find refuge have been historically Pakistan and Iran. Today, the Islamic Republics of Pakistan and Iran host almost 1 million and 700,000 refugees, respectively. And they are from Afghanistan, of course. But their living conditions in the two countries are extremely precarious, again, are extremely worrying, concerning. For example, in Iran, legal restrictions, bureaucratic hurdles continuously violate Afghan refugees, human rights. In Iran, Afghans witness continuing violations such as forced deportations back to Afghanistan, the denial of education rights, complete lack of economic opportunities, forced labor, lack of access to healthcare, and regular physical abuses. In some instances, even forced recruitment to fight in Syria has been reported among the Afghan population living in Iran. So we can understand the situation is not as good as it could be, of course. As for Pakistan, the living situation, the living conditions of Afghan refugees is even worse because Pakistan has not ratified nor signed the 1951 Refugee Convention. So in Pakistan, all the Afghan refugees registered in Pakistan are completely deprived of this basic form of legal protection. As we were listening before, the evacuation effort in August 2021, when the US and its allies left Kabul, managed to rescue a lot of people with Afghan citizenship who cooperated in the last 20 years with Western powers. but the exact numbers of people who have been rescued is not there's not an exact official number of people rescued, and we will probably never know how many had to be left in Afghanistan. Today, after the evacuation effort found an end in early September, when the last American troops left the country and when Kabul airport, which we were all seeing on television during the last days of August, was closed and would have been only opened months later. Today, leaving Afghanistan is extremely difficult, not only because even though the airport is open again, flights outside flights to leave Afghanistan are now extremely expensive to purchase, so not everyone can do that, but also because Taliban authorities are not extremely happy with people living in the country, because of course this makes it would make them look bad in the eyes of the international community, whilst they are really keen on giving a good picture to the world of their new enlightened regime, let's say so. And so whilst the Taliban have provided explicit assurances that Afghan citizens with foreign travel authorization can leave the country, this still violates international human rights law, because according to international human rights law, and in particular to paragraph 1 of Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has the right to leave a country and to seek asylum in a different country from the one of his or her citizenship. So, of course, requiring an explicit foreign authorization to leave one's country is against this fundamental right. And in fact, in the last days of August, the United Nations Security Council adopted a resolution expressing its hope that the Taliban will actually adhere to their international commitments and provide people with the right to leave the country if they wish so. However, it remains to be seen whether or not the Taliban will actually abide by their international commitments and actually listen to the UN Security Council. So, as I was saying, the situation, even though the biggest section of Afghan refugees found themselves in neighboring countries, a lot of them tried and are still trying to reach Europe, but unfortunately today this has become extremely difficult in light of the recent invasion of Ukraine, which pushed a lot of Ukrainian nationals, as we have seen, to the EU. Therefore, only a small fraction of those Afghan asylum seekers who leave Afghanistan actually make it to Europe. And even when they do arrive in the European Union, their living conditions are getting worse and worse because of this new influx of asylum seekers from Eastern Europe. And for example, just to provide you with a concrete example of how the living situation of Afghan refugees has worsened due to the conflict in Ukraine. In Germany, hundreds of Afghans have actually not been required to leave their homes, but they have actually been evicted by the central government by a decision which was made by Berlin's Senate Department for Integration, Labor and Social Services, which argued that this collective eviction was operationally necessary and that there were no alternatives because there were a lot of Ukrainians, including many women and children, who needed a roof over their heads, just like Afghans do not need a roof over their head. Anyway, In addition, we have heard that dozens of Afghans are currently stuck between Poland and Belarus. And finally, Afghans are also stuck in Ukraine because a lot of Afghans who fled the country in August, they fled to Eastern Europe. So they arrived in Ukraine and they're currently stranded in Ukraine. And if you follow the news, it has been extremely difficult for people with no Ukrainian citizenship to leave Ukraine, at least at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. So this is also quite concerning. They are refugees, so they are a group of refugees within refugees, if we can say so, if we can imagine something like that. Sorry. So in conclusion, we have seen that the crisis in Afghanistan is one of the most protracted one in the world. Afghanistan has been witnessing people trying to leave since 1979, so it has been more than 40 years. And refugees and IDPs' living conditions are rapidly deteriorating. Therefore, the international community should focus its efforts in trying to alleviate the plight and the difficulties faced by Afghan migrants and try to counter the economic, political, and security consequences of the Taliban takeover in August. And finally, I would like to stress that the emergency measures that we have seen are being adopted in connection with other migration crises should not in any way be implemented in such a way as to violate the international framework on human rights, and in particular the principle of non-discrimination, which is a fundamental principle within the international human rights law framework. And the moral and legal imperative of rescuing refugees should not lead Europe nor other places or countries to differentiate between different categories of refugees and asylum seekers with differentiated rights and levels of protection, because everyone deserves protection regardless of their citizenship or skin color. Thank you. That would be it on my end. I have to apologize. I have to run because I also have a seminar.
Yeah, thank you, Francesca. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I know that we are a bit late in this seminar that is really rich of perspective. And thank you so much, Francesca. And now we move to the third and last presentation of this morning seminar of Kamila Galitz. Kamila graduated summa cum laude in law from University of Pécs, Hungary in 2019. Parallel to her legal studies, she obtained a bachelor's degree in Italian and Portuguese language and literature and a postgraduate degree in translation. She gained professional experience, first as country of origin information specialist at the Hungarian Immigration and Asylum Office, then as a trainee lawyer at a prestigious law firm with a wide Italian and English-speaking clientele. Her PhD research focuses on evidentiary relevance of non-legal sources in administrative and judicial proceedings related to international protection. Thank you, Kamila. She will analyze the EU emergency migration response towards Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
So thank you. First of all, I would like to thank all today's speakers for the thoughtful and exhaustive presentations. And I'm honored to conclude both session 3 on Afghanistan and the whole event with my contribution on the EU emergency migration response to the Afghan crisis. So just let me give you a short overview of my presentation. First, I will summarize the different ways in which the EU has been committed to the in Afghanistan from 2001 until the present day. Then I will outline the ways in which the EU assessed the takeover of the political power by the Taliban and what are the new ways in which EU support has been envisaged for future cooperation. Based on such assessment, I will present the different responses European governments have given to the Afghan crisis, and I will also outline the new ways in which the EU sees a cooperation with the Taliban-led Afghanistan. And I will conclude my presentation with a comparative overview on the different responses the EU has given to the crisis we have dealt with today. So, as a starting point, the EU the EU intervention has followed the US entrance in Afghanistan in 2001. And in the first years, European countries were engaged in bilateral agreements with Afghanistan. And in this pattern, a shift was achieved in 2006 London conference, which foresaw a new framework for cooperation between the international community and Afghanistan. Strictly in EU terms, it meant more securitarian programs, such as the key program for EU, the so-called EU Pole, which was aimed to mentor, to monitor, and to train Afghan police, the Afghan National Police, based on German projects. Strictly in migration and asylum field, the 2016 Brussels conference was of key importance because in this, the international community and Afghanistan set the goal to achieve Afghanistan's self-reliance in the transformation decade until 2024. Strictly between the EU and Afghanistan, the so-called joint way forward on migration issues was set up in this as part of this conference, in which on one hand the EU and on the other hand Afghanistan foresaw the strengthening of the cooperation on migration issues, but mainly to prevent irregular migration. And this program was aimed to organize the dignified, safe and orderly return of all Afghan nationals to Afghanistan who could not fulfill the eligibility criteria for international protection in the EU. Another important milestone between the EU, in the cooperation between the EU and Afghanistan, was achieved in Geneva Conference of 2020, in which the EU pledged a support of more than 1 billion euros for the period until 2025, but compared to previous supports, this development assistance was foresaw as conditional upon an inclusive, Afghan-owned and Afghan-led peace process. So there is a shift in the scheme for EU support to the country. As the Joint Way Forward program ended in 2020, a new program was also envisaged, and it was set up a year ago, precisely the year ago, on the 26th of April. This was the so-called Joint Declaration on Migration Cooperation, but still, as in case of the Joint Way Forward program, we see a clear focus on returning Afghan nationals rather than helping them to integrate in EU member states. To the question of a number of members of European Parliament regarding the EU support in case of a Taliban being involved in the Afghan cabinet, the Commission has provided a written answer in June 2021, stating that future EU support to Afghanistan will depend on the government's continued commitment to democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and gender equality. As we know, 2 months later on, the Taliban took over of the political power, and shortly after this takeover, the Council of the Ministers of Home Affairs issued a statement regarding the evacuation programs to be foreseen by European countries and also to future humanitarian aid to Afghanistan. And in this statement, the Council set forward that the priority is given to EU citizens and only to those Afghan nationals who have cooperated with the EU as a whole or with the member states and their respective family members. As regards the humanitarian aid, we see a clear continuation from the Geneva conference in terms that humanitarian aid is first of all provided to in an indirect manner, so to international organizations and upon conditions, and also to neighboring countries who are hosting and who have been hosting for a long time Afghan refugees. So there is a clear focus on strengthening the external cooperation on migration by the EU side, and also there is a clear continuation of this indirect manner of supporting. As after this statement, the Council issued also a conclusion at the end of September in which it set five guiding principles for EU future engagement in Afghanistan. And let me just highlight one, the first benchmark, which has to be followed by the de facto Afghan cabinet in order to get EU support, which is to allow the safe and secure departure of all foreign nationals, including Afghans, in accordance with the UN resolution that Francesca referred to in her presentation, and in light of the freedom of movement. So the new cabinet has to follow these guiding principles in order to get some cooperation with the EU. And as you can see, the single European governments have set up their own evacuation programs in light of those priorities set up by the Council. And the eligibility criteria are more or less the same. So to prioritize the Afghan nationals who have cooperated with the EU and with its member states. The scale of evacuation programs were greatly dependent on the member states' military capacity. So only those member states could engage in large-scale evacuation programs whose military capacity allowed to do so. So, for example, the UK evacuated more than 15,000 people, and not only British citizens and Afghan nationals, but also third country nationals. Italy evacuated 5,000 people. On the other hand, smaller countries like Slovenia or Hungary could not engage in such large-scale evacuations. Slovenia evacuated 20, 30 people, Hungary 450 people. As regards the different forms of protection to be granted to Afghan nationals, there are huge differences in the responses of European countries. For example, in Italy, France, Germany, also Hungary, most claims submitted by Afghan nationals are channeled in the normal asylum procedure. However, France and Spain declared to give priority to the claims submitted by Afghan nationals. And other countries, like the Czech Republic or Sweden, granted protection status automatically to Afghan nationals. A third group of countries, like Belgium or Denmark, issued a special residence permit to Afghan nationals. As regards the details, some issues of the decision-making process, most countries have suspended return of Afghan nationals to Afghanistan, and for a time being, also most countries also suspended the making of decisions. However, for example, Finland suspended the making of negative decisions, on the other hand, continued to issue positive decisions. Germany, for example, has suspended the making of decisions, but restarted again after the EASO's country of origin report on Afghanistan in November 2021. As regards the future pathways for those seeking protection in Afghanistan, there are countries who have no possibility to grant humanitarian visa to Afghan nationals, such as Austria, Croatia, or Slovenia. Other countries have an already existing framework for humanitarian visas, like Finland or France. And I would like to highlight a best practice implemented in Italy. The Ministry of Home and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs signed a protocol for the opening of humanitarian corridors for Afghan nationals in November 2021 with the collaboration of the IOM, the UNHCR, and a number of civil society organizations. And this protocol foresees a legal channel of entry into Italy for more than 1,000 Afghan citizens. But it's very important to highlight that these Afghan citizens are residing in the neighboring countries. So the opening of such humanitarian corridors does not address those strained in Afghanistan, but those already residing in the neighboring countries, like in Iran or in Pakistan. So as regards the EU support, in October, the Commission announced the launch of a 1 billion support package in which also a humanitarian aid of more than 200 million euros funding is also envisaged. And a Commission also issued a press release at the end of January in which it highlighted a program of nearly 300 million euros through international organizations, mainly UN agencies. And we can see that one part of this funding consists of 5 projects who are aimed to address forced displacement and migration. But we have to recall the statement of the Council from September 2021, because these supports are envisaged upon the conditions, upon those 5 benchmarks I've already highlighted, and they are envisaged to be channeled in a direct manner through international organizations, mainly UN agencies. And at the end of January, a number of members of the European Parliament submitted the following questions to a written answer for the Commission regarding the possible activation of the Directive on Temporary Protection in the Afghan case, also the opening of humanitarian corridors for the people who are still stranded in Afghanistan, and to the possible implementation of other humanitarian actions. As for today, the Commission has not provided a written answer yet to these questions. And as to conclude my presentation, we can ask the same questions to ourselves, what the EU will do in order to mitigate the crisis in Afghanistan. And to conclude the whole event, I want just to briefly highlight the different ways in which the EU has reacted to the 3 crisis situations we have dealt today with. So as we could see, only in the Ukrainian crisis, the EU has adopted to activate the Directive on Temporary Protection, which led to, at national level, to issuance of residence permits and to the recognition of a number of different rights. And in case of the EU, or the humanitarian situation created at the EU and Belarus border, we could see that there is a proposal to implement emergency, temporary and exceptional measures, but only in 3 member states, in Lithuania, Latvia and Poland. So as Chiara, Dr. Scissa said, there is a focus on the member states rather than on the people in need. And as we could see in the case of the Afghan crisis, there was a common pattern in the evacuation plans to prioritize the Afghan nationals who have collaborated with the EU and Western powers in general, but there were huge, and still there are huge differences in granting forms of protection in the decision-making process. And as we could see, there are different ways in which the EU envisaged its support in the different crisis situations, and we can just hope that they will be able to mitigate such crisis. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kamila, for your really interesting presentation, especially this last table with the comparison between the situation at the Belarus border, Ukrainian and Afghanistan is really clearly useful for as a conclusion of our morning seminar. I just have a question. Maybe there are other questions. I don't know. Yes, Chiara, and then please, Chiara, come, and then I will have another question.
Okay, thank you very much to all the three speakers of this last session. I don't know if Naided is still here. I have a question for her. I saw a very strong reportage on the situations going on in Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover, and I saw this huge queue in front of the Pakistan embassy and the Iran's embassy in order to get visa, in order to get out of the country. But still, in that reportage, it was highlighted that many people who gain this kind of visa then are still blocked in the country because of the lack of possibilities to still get out of the country and go in Afghanistan, in Pakistan and Iran. So basically the visa is just a dead note on a paper and that's it. So I was wondering what was her opinion on this. And then I have a question for Kamila. I think, I'm pretty sure, but maybe I'm mistaken. There was some EU coordinated humanitarian corridors at the very beginning of the Taliban takeover, so like August 2021. But then there was an initial coordination of efforts, and then it lasted for like 2 weeks, and then the Belarus crisis began, so the whole focus changed. Do you know something about that, or maybe I was just mistaken? Thank you.
My question is really connected with this last question of Chiara regarding the humanitarian corridors for Kamila. You mentioned a best practice, for example, Italy activated humanitarian corridors from Afghanistan. And I was wondering, in your opinion, what the European Union could do to implement, to stimulate member states to activate humanitarian corridors, or to promote a framework for a European Union humanitarian corridors, if you have some point on that. Thank you very much.
So I would start if Nahid is here, or okay, and then I will.
Yes,
I will start.
Sorry, yes, I'm here.
Okay, Nahid, if you would like to start, please.
Okay, answer to the question of Chiara, I have to say that from a few months after Taliban seized power in Afghanistan, all embassies were closed, including Iran and Pakistan. And they didn't issue visa for people, and just Iran issue visa for specific cases, like for for health issue. They issue visa in certain cases, and also for those who had transit visa to third country. For other cases, they banned issuing visa, and people trying to cross the border illegally. And unfortunately, even Taliban, they controlled the borders, and with difficulty they could reach with those borders, but still it was possible for them to reach the borders. But illegally they couldn't. And recently I hear that Iranian, they start to issue the visa, even Pakistan. The embassy operating, and they issue a visa for the people in Afghanistan. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so as regards the question, Chiara's question, So different European countries declared to be keen on opening humanitarian corridors. For example, Germany as well, and also Portugal. But as for the present day, there were no clear actions implemented in this regard. Also, in case of Italy, for example, the protocol was signed in the beginning of November 2021, but it's the civil society organization are still waiting for the ministries engaged to set up the transfer of those people. And for example, in the beginning of August, 6 member states issued a joint letter to the Commission in order to declare their intention to carry on implementing returns to Afghanistan. After the Taliban's takeover, they withdrew this their intent to do so, but there was a clear intent on behalf of countries like Austria, Germany, Belgium, Denmark, Greece, and the Netherlands to carry on returns to Afghanistan. As regards the question of the professor, in order to, so the problem is with all issues of international protection and migration crisis is laid down in the treaties because we have a field in which the integration is split apart between the member states. So the member states have the last say. So if there were a framework, a directive or something on the opening of humanitarian corridors, it would be more, it would be easier to motivate, to encourage member states to be more keen on opening such humanitarian corridors. But with the present framework, and we can see that also with the new pact on migration and asylum, we don't see much a step forward in this regard. Member states are left alone, which also means that they have the last say in this regard, and they will decide in also in procedural matters and also in the setting up of humanitarian corridors. As we can see in case of Ukraine, we can already see some civil society organization actions, but in the Afghan case, we don't see that much of a solidarity towards the Afghan people.
Thank you very much, Kamila. So yeah, we are at the conclusion of our morning seminar. It was really an interesting events, inspiring events for our activities research, a way to compare different challenges for the European Union, Afghanistan, Ukrainian, and the Belarus border. So thank you, everybody, and yeah, we will update. I hope that we will update in the next month about these 3 important, crucial area and the condition of migrants in this area. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody online.
Thank you too.
Bye
Thank
bye.
you so much.
Bye bye. Thank you, Nahid. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye bye.
Okay. Great.